I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Hey, fanfic family. So glad to see you here again to continue this incredible adventure. As always, kindly remember, this story is 100% fiction. So don't go looking for dimensional portals in your closet. All rights to this fantastic novel belong to the original author. We're just your humble narrators of epic tales. Are you enjoying the fanfic? Show it by subscribing to our YouTube channel and dropping us a like. And if you're impatient for more exclusive content, our Patreon is your happy place. Chapter 401. How do you plan to revise it? The atmosphere at the dinner table was relaxed and cheerful, with Charles and Elisa chatting about teachers and classmates. After the meal, Charles gentlemanly saw Elisa and Aunt Lena to their car and asked Laurent to take them home. Western interpersonal relationships weren't complicated, they followed the same routine, becoming standardized. However, this might only apply to ordinary people. Charles's social circle wasn't wide. He'd heard that upper-class relationships could be so complex that there was no distinction between people and mass revelry. Back in the room, Camille hurriedly dropped the plates and came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands as she asked Charles, her eyes full of expectation, "What do you think? What do you mean?" Charles feigned ignorance. "Come on, you're 18 already," Camille said. "It's time to find a girlfriend, while you're in the army, busy saving the world all day." Charles rolled his eyes. Saving the world was a derogatory term in modern times. However, what Charles was doing did indeed seem to be saving the world. "Elisa is a good girl," Camille said, pulling Charles to sit down at the table. "She joined the communications corps, so she's practically a member of the army, and she's fighting for France too." The communications corps, Charles had never heard of that designation before. "Yes," Camille replied, though she wasn't entirely sure herself, her gaze unconsciously shifting to Djoka. Djoka chimed in, "It was established 3 months ago. The military started hiring women for communications duties. They mainly deliver messages or documents by motorcycle, usually operating in safe rear areas." Charles understood. This was due to manpower shortages. Later, women would be replaced in the workforce, farm work, weapons and ammunition factories, and even in positions like police and politicians. Essentially, men went to the front lines, leaving the rear work to women. This also created an opportunity for women to improve their social standing. The image above shows female suffrage in Britain during World War I. Camille leaned closer and continued to encourage, "She's still your admirer, Charles. Her father is a soldier, an active duty major, and I think you'll have a lot in common." "Mom," Charles interrupted Camille, "we're not a good match. She looks too young." Camille looked at Charles in surprise. "But she's your classmate, Charles, you're the same age?" Djoka nodded slightly in understanding. This wasn't a matter of age. Charles's understanding was far beyond that of an 18-year-old. The conversations of his peers would likely only be described as childish in his eyes. Djoka remarked with a touch of irony, "What Charles might need is a girlfriend he can discuss war, inventions, or making money with." Camille turned and glared at Djoka. "You think there's such a woman? Someone as outstanding as Charles?" Djoka replied, "I'm not sure, but I think she shouldn't be like Elisa." Camille's expression hardened, his voice tinged with anger. "Then tell me, what kind of woman would she be?" "I've already said that," Djoka replied, shrugging. "It depends on fate, Camille. I believe there will always be such a person." Charles seized the opportunity to stand up. "Tell me when you've discussed it. I'm a little tired." He then fled down the stairs into his room, leaving Camille and Djoka staring at each other in the living room. Having not slept in until he naturally woke up in his room for a long time, Charles threw off the covers, stretched, and looked out the window to find the sun already high in the sky. Suddenly remembering his plans for the day, he cursed, "Damn it, I overslept." He hurriedly put on his uniform, went downstairs, grabbed a piece of bread from the dining table, and rushed out the door. Camille, who seemed to have been preparing lunch, chased after him, calling out, "Where are you going, Charles?" "The tractor factory," Charles replied, waving without turning back. It was only a few hundred meters, so Charles didn't bother calling Laurent to pick him up and simply chose to walk, or rather, jog. Along the way, neighbors waved enthusiastically to Charles. Aunt Elisa called out, "Want a croissant, Charles?" "No." Charles waved the bread in his hand. "Thank you, Aunt Elisa." Aunt Cara poked her head out of the pizzeria and called to Charles, "Slow down, little guy. Which country is waiting for you to save it?" Charles, chewing on bread, couldn't speak, only waving halfway around. Guards caught up from both sides. At first there were only two, but soon more and more came, rifles clutched to their backs, as if they were going to battle. A captain nervously stepped forward and asked, "What happened, Brigadier General? Should I notify someone else?" "No, nothing." Charles felt somewhat helpless, a sense of being constantly watched. "Return to your posts." "Yes, Brigadier General." The guards stopped and dispersed under the captain's command. A dozen minutes later, Charles rushed into Joca's office, asking, "Father, where did you put Saint Samand?" "Saint Samand," Joca recalled for a moment, "in the warehouse. It's been there since it arrived from Paris. It was transported by rail, which goes directly to the tractor factory warehouse." Charles took out his pocket watch and checked the time. It was a little past 11 o'clock, and he still had more than 4 hours before he had to report back to camp. He had to hurry. "Who's in charge of the Tractor Factory Research Institute now, Father?" Charles asked. "It's always been Joseph," Joca asked suspiciously. "What's wrong?" Matthew's father didn't understand equipment, he was only responsible for coordination and logistics. "What about the design?" Charles asked again. "Matthew," Joca replied, "he and Colonel Estany are both. They often discuss and exchange ideas together, and it's said they're considering designing a new type of tank." Estany and Matthew are a perfect match. The former leaned more towards military tactics and battlefield experience, while the latter leaned towards mechanical manufacturing and implementation. Thus, the new tank was taking shape. But Charles wasn't concerned about that at the moment. "Call Matthew over," Charles said. "I'll wait for him at the warehouse." In the third warehouse of the tractor factory, the interior was dimly lit because the windows were all sealed for secrecy. The lights came on, revealing 3 Saint Cham tractors. Charles walked around one of them twice, occasionally measuring it with his hand. Just then, he heard hesitant footsteps behind him. Matthew stood in the doorway, smiling at Charles. "Long time no see. Look at you, you're a brigadier general now. How are things?" Charles glanced at Matthew. He had grown a beard, which made him look more mature. His cheeks were thinner, but his eyes were bright and piercing. Matthew shrugged, laughing heartily. "Can't you tell?" With that, Matthew pulled up a chair, sat down sideways, and turned his gaze to the Saint Cham. "So, what are your plans for modification?" Chapter 402 Cheap Version. Charles looked at Matthew in surprise. "How did you know I was going to make changes?" "Please, Charles." Matthew laughed. "What do you think I've been doing all this time?" Charles asked doubtfully. "Wasn't it improving the engine?" That was the task Charles had given Matthew. He was in charge of tank engine development. Matthew nodded. "Indeed, but I've also been researching tanks, Charles. Tanks are used on the battlefield, and to develop an excellent tank, I must understand the battlefield. I've learned a lot from Colonel Estany." Charles understood. Matthew had infiltrated military theory. "Do you know what I discovered?" Matthew asked. "What?" Charles asked. Matthew gave Charles a thumbs up. "You're amazing." Charles laughed. He thought Matthew was joking. That was just his personality, always so nonchalant. But Matthew didn't laugh. He added solemnly, "I'm serious, Charles. The more I know, the more amazing you seem. They say your tactics are unpredictable and flexible, and I wholeheartedly agree. Sometimes I even feel like you know what the future holds, which is incredible." Charles was startled. Had he been seen through? "Let's not talk about that." Charles quickly changed the subject. "You still haven't answered me. How did you know I was going to make changes?" Matthew propped himself up from his chair, limped over to the Saint Cham, examined its protruding cannon barrel, and said, "You bought the Saint Cham and sent them to the police base, and then sent a few more to the tractor factory." "That's when I knew you were going to make changes." Charles suddenly understood. He sent the Saint Cham to the police base for training and to the tractor factory for improvement, so that training and improvement could be done simultaneously. Matthew made his judgment based on this. Before Charles could say anything, Matthew interrupted. "I guess you're going to remove all the machine guns and add a rotating turret to it, right?" Matthew thought Charles's modification was aimed at the German new tank Upper Silesia, as the 75mm gun could penetrate the Upper Silesia at a greater distance. He made a bet with Colonel Estany on the phone. "The improvement direction for the Charles A1 is to thicken the armor, so we need a tank with a larger cannon caliber to completely suppress the German Upper Silesia with both long-range and close-range firepower. I think it's the Saint Salmon." Estany thought Matthew's analysis made sense, but still thought it was unlikely. "If that's the case, we can design a new tank without buying the Saint Salmon. Because there are no intellectual property issues with it, Matthew replied. We'll see, Colonel. I'll bet 2 packs of gypsies. At this moment, Matthew looked at Charles with full confidence. I guessed right, didn't I? Charles smiled and shook his head. Half right. The machine gun does need to be removed, but the rotating turret is unnecessary. Matthew's smile froze. How is that possible? Then how will it deal with the upper Silesia? It's just a cannon, Matthew, Charles replied. Equipment isn't always better the more complex it is. Sometimes simplicity, reliability, low cost, and quantity are more important. Matthew frowned. But the Saint-Chamond isn't cheap. Charles didn't answer. He stepped forward and pointed to the front and rear ends of the Saint-Chamond, saying, after removing the 4 machine guns, there's a lot of space left. So we can shorten the front and rear to improve its off-road capability. Matthew hummed in agreement. The biggest drawback of the Saint-Chamond was precisely this. The protruding front and rear ends made it easy to get stuck on the battlefield. Move the center of gravity of the gun to the middle, Charles added. This will prevent it from being top-heavy. Matthew nodded in agreement. The Saint-Chamond's top-heavy design prevented the front armor from being thickened. Finally, Charles patted the front, isolate the cockpit from the rear hull. Matthew stared at Charles with wide eyes. No, we can't do that. Matthew knew why Charles was doing this. The 75mm gun would produce a lot of smoke when firing, and isolating it from the rear would prevent the smoke from affecting the driver and artillery observers at the front. However, this makes no sense, Charles, Matthew said. Have you considered that the noise from the engine and cannon inside the tank makes communication between crew members already difficult? If we further isolate them, they won't even be able to hear each other shouting. The Saint-Chamond would be artificially divided into 2 parts, each fighting independently. They can communicate, Charles calmly replied. We just need to install telephones in the front and rear compartments. Matthew froze, then suddenly burst out laughing. You bastard, how did you come up with that? Telephones inside a tank. With that, the last headache for the Saint-Chamond was solved. The driver and artillery observer in the front compartment wouldn't be affected by the smoke in the rear compartment. The rear compartment could use gas masks to deal with the smoke, and the front and rear compartments could communicate by telephone. Charles even came up with a special gas mask that could be used for an extended period of time. The image above shows a box-type gas mask invented in 1916. Characterized by its long service life and easy filter replacement. After listening to Charles's description, Matthew had a clear picture in his mind. He nodded confidently. These modifications, although they seem like big changes on the surface, are actually just adjustments to the shape and position. The chassis, engine, transmission, and other complex components remain unchanged, so it's not difficult. It won't take long to complete. 1 month. Charles gave a deadline. Can you complete the modifications to all the Saint-Chamonds within a month? Matthew hesitated for a moment, then gritted his teeth and nodded heavily. I can, but this is just an improvement. Matthew tapped the steel plate of the Saint-Chamond and said, I still don't see how cheap it is. If we were to mass produce it as you say, just 100 or so engines would take several months to produce. There's another cheaper version, Charles said. What? Matthew couldn't believe it. There was nothing left to reduce, right? It was already a chassis plus a cannon. Could they really remove the chassis? Charles pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Matthew. It was a drawing he had made the night before. Matthew took it, unfolded it, and froze instantly. After a long pause, he exclaimed, It's definitely a cheap version. It was a truck-mounted artillery piece, a simple cannon mounted on the back of a truck, almost a combination of a truck and a 75mm gun. The image above shows the Soviet Su-12-176mm self-propelled howitzer, which played a significant role in the Battle of Kochangal. Chapter 403 People's Military Abilities. Charles and Matthew spent over 3 hours discussing the details of Saint-Chamond and the truck-mounted artillery, without even having lunch. It wasn't until Djoka arrived and, after understanding the situation, brought them a meal. It was potato pizza from the canteen, and surprisingly, it tasted quite good. Perhaps Charles was a bit hungry. Matthew, chewing on the pizza, asked, although this isn't something I need to know, isn't a truck-mounted artillery setup too dangerous? Matthew pointed to the sketch Charles had drawn. The artillerymen are all on the trucks, and without any protection. Charles hummed in agreement. When a shell explodes, shrapnel radiates upwards. The artillerymen on the trucks are at a high position, making them highly likely to be hit by shrapnel. However, The key is where they're going to use it, Matthew, Charles replied. Where? Matthew looked at Charles with a puzzled expression. Isn't it on the battlefield? Everyone has to be on the battlefield. Of course it's on the battlefield, but even on the battlefield, there's a front and a rear. Charles nodded towards the Saint Salmon parked in the warehouse. The truck-mounted artillery follows behind the Saint Salmon. Matthew said oh, and understood. The Saint Salmon would charge ahead, braving enemy fire and forcing back the enemy artillery, before the truck-mounted artillery would follow. Charles was certain this thing would work, even though it seemed unsafe. It still existed in modern times because artillery often required mass bombardment of targets, while self-propelled artillery was often unsuitable for mass deployment due to its cost. Truck-mounted artillery, on the other hand, could achieve almost the same firepower output at half the cost of self-propelled artillery, and could be incredibly effective when used in the right situation, thus making it highly favored by various countries. The image above shows the modern Archer truck-mounted artillery. While its performance is good, its unclear positioning defeats the purpose of a truck-mounted artillery piece. It costs more than tracked self-propelled artillery, yet lacks the off-road capability and protection of tracked self-propelled artillery, and cannot be mass-produced. Charles hurriedly stuffed the remaining pizza into his mouth, checked the time, and realized it was almost time to report back to the barracks. He said goodbye to Matthew while chewing his food, and before leaving, he instructed Dayoka, "Father, the steelworkers' training should ideally be completed within 3 months so they can be on the job." "No problem," Dayoka nodded. "They've already started." Matthew was somewhat surprised. Charles had requested that the Saint Sham be modified within a month, but the steelworkers were scheduled to be ready in 3 months. This seemed a bit odd. After considering for a moment, Matthew smiled slightly, seemingly understanding Charles's intention. On the car back to the barracks, Charles casually flipped through the documents Dayoka had given him. They were the operational status of the Bernard Company. Since Charles spent most of his time serving in the military and couldn't handle company affairs, Joka could only report to him in this way. However, this wasn't really necessary, as Charles wasn't particularly interested in the large amount of data. He could understand the literal meaning, but ultimately didn't understand anything. In short, as long as it was profitable, that was fine. General Laurent, who was driving, tilted his head back slightly. Italy has launched an attack on Austria-Hungary, but progress doesn't seem to be going well. Charles grunted and continued flipping through the documents. It would be strange if the Italian attack went smoothly. The battlefield wasn't purely a matter of troop strength. The Italian tactics were extremely outdated. They were practically a carbon copy of the French offensive theory, albeit poorly equipped. Austria-Hungary, on the other hand, had much more defensive experience by this point. They were constructing multiple trenches facing the Italians. When the Italians bombarded, the Austrians would temporarily retreat to the second trench, and then immediately return to the first trench to organize their defenses after the bombardment ended. Often, the Italians were doing futile work, but they remained completely unaware of it. "Some people think Joffre should transfer you to Army Group East," Laurent said. "What?" Charles looked up at Laurent in surprise. "Who would think that? Did they know Joffre and he were mortal enemies?" Laurent saw Charles' reaction in the rearview mirror and quickly explained, "It's because of the recent Schneider incident." "People think you've reconciled with Joffre?" Charles suddenly understood. It was a consequence of the purchase of Saint-Samant. Schneider's public statements, claiming a certain level of consensus with Bernard Company and a united front against the enemy, led people to mistakenly believe Charles would ally with Schneider. And Joffre, being part of Schneider's faction, should naturally fight alongside Charles. Charles sighed softly. France was vast. There were always people with unrealistic ideas. The conflict between Charles and himself was almost irreconcilable. Joffre desperately needed victory to secure his position as commander-in-chief, while Charles was the one who was truly achieving victory and constantly threatening his position. Laurent cautiously added, "Furthermore, they believe you can only cooperate with Italy under Army Group East." Charles nodded slightly. As the war progressed, military skills had indeed improved significantly. However, their expectations of Italy were too high. The war had only just begun, the Austro-Hungarian hurdle hadn't even been overcome, yet they were already considering coordinating with Italy to encircle the German army. The blue area in the image above represents the Italian offensive direction, corresponding to the red area marked in the first image. If the Italian army advanced north through the narrow strip of Austro-Hungarian territory into Germany, they could then join forces with France to encircle the Western Front. At the French general headquarters, Joffre also heard similar rumors. Initially, Joffre found the idea ridiculous. Bring Charles in? Would that be admitting Charles was superior? How would he, as commander-in-chief, position himself? If Charles offered a suggestion, would Joffre agree or disagree? Agree, and if the war was won, it would be Charles's achievement. Disagree, and if the war was lost, it would all be Joffre's fault. Joffre found it strange that there were problems regardless of whether he agreed or disagreed. After thinking for a while, he realized the key was that Charles was always right. Agreeing meant victory, disagreeing meant defeat. However, after studying the map, Joffre found the proposed battle plan feasible. Once the Italian army broke through the Austro-Hungarian defenses and entered Germany, the German army would be attacked from both sides, or at least their supply lines could be attacked. This was an opportunity to break the deadlock. If this opportunity was lost, the disgruntled parliament might remove him from his position as commander-in-chief. Thinking this, Joffre didn't hesitate. He called the Paris garrison headquarters and confidently said, "General Gallieri, I think it's time to prepare. I believe our goals are the same, to drive the Germans out of French soil." Chapter 404 Delaying Tactics. When Charles entered the city defense command headquarters, he sensed a somewhat oppressive atmosphere. The staff officers whispered amongst themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand was speaking to Gallieri, whose brow was furrowed, his eyes filled with anger, as he stared intently at the map on the table. When they saw Charles enter, their expressions instantly shifted to helplessness and sympathy. Several staff officers even shook their heads and sighed, seemingly indignant on Charles's behalf. "What's wrong?" Charles asked, puzzled. Gallieri replied, "Joffre intends to transfer you and your troops to Army Group East." "What?" Charles was stunned, almost bursting out laughing. This guy really intended to follow the publicly discussed plan? Please, that was already a well-known plan, and if the public could think of it, how could the Germans not? And indeed, it was, not just similar, but exactly the same. Gallieri pointed to the map and said, "He thinks we should prepare to coordinate with Italy to encircle the Germans. Once the Italian army advances north and threatens the German flank and rear, we should launch a full-scale attack to rout them. This will allow the Italian army to form a pincer movement against the Germans, and an attack requires tanks, and right now only your unit has tanks." Charles thought of his recent purchase of the Saint-Samin tanks and industrial rights, and how the 1st Special Artillery Division Saint-Samin tanks were almost completely wiped out in the Battle of Cambrai. So, indeed, only Charles's unit had tanks, apart from the Upper Silesia tanks captured from the Germans. "I can sell him the tanks," Charles replied. "He can rebuild his tank force anytime he wants, whether it's the Saint-Samin or the Char A1. Gallieri shook his head. "We all know that's an excuse, Brigadier General. We should be thinking more about tanks and things outside the operational plan." Things outside the plan. Charles didn't understand what Gallieri meant. Gallieri nodded. "Once you and your troops are under Joffre's command, you might be sent on dangerous missions." "Do you understand what I mean?" Charles instantly understood. Using public office for private gain, using someone else to do his dirty work. It wasn't hard to imagine that a single order from Joffre could put Charles in a dilemma. To obey meant risking his life with his troops. To disobey was to be cowardly and disobey orders, leading to disgrace in a military court. Even on the battlefield, victory or defeat was unacceptable. Victory would be credited to Joffre's command. Defeat would endanger Charles's life, and even if he survived, his reputation would be damaged, and he might face punishment. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand suggested, "We can assign Charles other missions and then use this as an excuse to refuse." Gallieri shook his head. "No mission is more important than Italy right now, Lieutenant Colonel. The fighting in that direction could almost determine whether the war ends." Charles was speechless. Even Gallieri shared this view. No wonder. Who would have thought that Italy, with its million-strong army, couldn't even break through the Austro-Hungarian border? Then, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand continued, "We can give the Brigadier General leave. After all, he's the one who brought Italy into the Entente, and I still think a day off is too little." Gallieni interrupted Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. "It's useless, Lieutenant Colonel. The war has already begun. At crucial moments, even on leave, the Brigadier General should return to the army to fight." The others were also trying to come up with ideas, offering suggestions all at once. "We can consider sending the Brigadier General to Gallipoli. The fighting there is equally important. I heard they were almost at their breaking point. Or we can send the Brigadier General directly to Italy to coordinate with them." "Yes, That's better than him taking orders from Joffre. However, all these excuses were weak and unconvincing. Gallieni looked at Charles, his eyes questioning and a hint of anxiety. Charles calmly replied, I think this plan is feasible. I can go to Army Group East. What? Gallieni thought he had misheard. The others stared at Charles in shock. Everyone else was trying to pull him out of the fire, but he was jumping right in. Charles shrugged non-committally. However, I don't think it's the right time yet. Gallieni asked, what's wrong with the time? Charles pointed to the map seriously. The Italian army has only just launched its offensive on the border, and their advance is still at least 100 kilometers away from threatening German supply lines. If we send tank units to reinforce Army Group East now, firstly, it would prematurely expose our strategic intentions. Secondly, the supplies needed for the tank units would place a heavy burden on logistics. And thirdly, the tank units would be unable to conduct normal training and would only be waiting idly on the front lines. Gallieni agreed. Tank units are different from ordinary units. Ordinary units only need food and ammunition. Tank units need gasoline, spare parts, and other necessities, and they also need logistical support. Training on the front lines would easily expose them. Therefore, Charles concluded, I don't think we should rush things. The tank units can train in the rear first, and we can head to Army Group East after Italy breaks through the Austro-Hungarian border and advances into Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand and the other staff officers nodded in agreement. Indeed, that's how it should be. But their voices were soft and lacked confidence. They believed Charles was using this as a delaying tactic, a way to postpone their deployment to Army Group East to take command of Joffre as much as possible, a last resort. Gallieni thought so too. He was even confused by Charles. Did it make sense? It only delayed things by a few days, or maybe a little longer. But eventually, what was coming would come, and Charles would have to face it one day. The key was to find a fundamental solution to the problem. However, Gallieni saw confidence in Charles's eyes. He seemed unconcerned about the problem. What was going on? Did Charles have a way to deal with Joffre? Or was Charles certain that Italy couldn't win this battle? Impossible. In the end, Gallieni, unable to find a better solution, could only reluctantly relay Charles's words to Joffre. We obey orders, General. Charles will report to you at Army Group East after the Italian forces break through the enemy lines. Joffre was overjoyed. This time, Charles was trapped. Under his command, he could do whatever he wanted. Joffre smugly turned his gaze to the map, already calculating in his mind, we can't let Charles get into trouble too early. We need to make him and the Germans both suffer heavy losses. Ideally, we should preserve some tanks. No, that's too obvious. We should make this battle more brutal so as not to arouse suspicion. Once we eliminate Charles, his factories, tanks, and even assets will be sitting ducks. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 405 Book Encryption. As Charles descended the stairs of the command post, a sense of crisis crept in. Joffre, as commander-in-chief of France, held the power to mobilize troops, and the military was a place where orders were strictly followed. This inherently posed an uncertain danger to Charles's future. Charles could use the Italian army to get through this crisis, but what if Joffre found another opportunity to issue a similar order in the future? Joffre seemed to have lost patience. He intended to put Charles within reach. To avoid this, there seemed to be only one way. Thinking this, Charles unconsciously headed towards the officers' club, only realizing he was a little early when he was almost there. It was still light. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a voice from inside the officers' club. General, are you here to see Lucia? The club door opened, and a woman dressed as a bartender appeared before Charles. Charles recognized her. It was Gerald, Lucia's colleague and friend, whom Lucia occasionally spoke of. Yes, Charles nodded. I can come back later, General, Gerald replied. She's off today, but I can have her come right away. If she's off, I can come another day. No, General, Gerald quickly explained. Lucia will be overjoyed if she knows you're here to see her. She won't want to miss this opportunity, I guarantee it. Charles paused, then smiled. Well done, Lucia, you've fooled Gerald. She's completely convinced of their relationship. Entering the club, Charles didn't sit in his usual spot but chose a chair by the window, slowly savoring the coffee Gerald had brought him. Just as he was finishing his coffee, Lucia came in, panting, from the headquarters entrance. She was in a hurry, only hastily applying some lipstick. She stopped at the club entrance, tidied her hair, and clutched her chest to calm her breathing, seemingly not wanting Charles to see her flustered state. Then she quickly took a mirror from her handbag, checked herself, and stepped inside. However, when she saw Charles sitting by the window, she felt uneasy. Lucia sat awkwardly opposite Charles, thinking, this guy must be so smug. It turns out this woman cares about him so much. Unexpectedly, Charles leaned closer and whispered, next time you don't need to rush. I usually don't come to see you urgently, although it might be important. Lucia was stunned. This guy actually thought she rushed over because of a mission? Understood, General, Lucia replied coldly. Any instructions? Charles leaned closer and asked, what's the situation in Grevy? Lucia shook her head slightly. Some progress, but we've encountered a problem. She heard Garrel's footsteps behind her and naturally changed the subject. Are you free this weekend? I don't want every day to be here, you know. Charles shook his head awkwardly. I don't have time, Lucia. I have a lot to do. Charles's acting was somewhat unnatural, but fortunately, Garrel didn't notice anything amiss. She brought Lucia a cup of coffee, smiled, nodded to the two of them, and walked away. Lucia continued, we can receive Grevy's telegrams, but they're encrypted with a book encryption. Charles hadn't heard of that. Yes, Lucia explained, it involves selecting a book and transmitting the page number, line number, and column number when sending the telegram. Charles understood. This encryption method was simple to use and difficult to crack because it had no pattern. You needed to know which book they were using. We even sent people to infiltrate Grevy's servants, but we haven't found anything. Lucia frowned. I suspect the codebook is in his safe. Charles was silent for a moment, then said, he might be making a move soon. Lucia understood, this meant Charles would soon lay a trap. However, without knowing the codebook, even if the fish took the bait, it would be useless. They could only watch helplessly as the fish slipped through their fingers. Lucia felt a pang of guilt. We'll find a way as soon as possible. I think there's someone we can use. Charles interrupted Lucia. Who? Harley? Lucia stared wide-eyed at Charles. That spy? Charles nodded. But she's a German spy. How can we use her? Lucia asked, puzzled. It's simple, Charles replied calmly. We know her secrets, so we can use that to blackmail her and recruit her as our spy. Lucia nodded slowly, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, but then shook her head. But Grevy isn't interested in women. Armand, Charles interrupted Lucia. Have Harley get close to Armand. Lucia instantly understood. Armand was a womanizer. Seducing him with Harley would be easy. With Harley's methods, he might be able to extract all the secrets he knew. Let's try. Lucia nodded, then glanced at Charles, asking with concern, what's wrong? Is something wrong? Before this, Charles hadn't cared about Grevy's affairs, giving the Madam in White ample time to investigate. Now, his sudden acceleration meant he must have encountered some difficulties. It's nothing, Charles replied. Just some trivial matters. In truth, these were no trivial matters. They concerned Charles's future and even his life. To keep Commander-in-Chief Joffre in check and prevent him from issuing orders to Charles, only Schneider and the Parliament were capable. And if Charles wanted sufficient influence in Parliament, he had to win over the right wing. Grevy was the obstacle between Charles and the right wing. He was intelligent, cautious, and, more importantly, had his own ideals and principles. Such a person was difficult to buy with money, so Charles had to consider eliminating him. As for Armand, his oratory skills might be useful, so he was also a target for recruitment. Also, Charles instructed Lucia before leaving, I need intelligence from the Cambrai area. It might require personnel cooperation. Lucia's eyes lit up instantly. The Belgian direction. Cambrai was near the Franco-Belgian border. If it was the Belgian direction, it meant Charles was going to invade Belgium and reclaim lost territory. Charles nodded slightly. There was no point in hiding this. He had to completely trust the lady in white. Lucia was so excited she almost cried out. Overwhelmed with emotion, she kissed Charles deeply on the cheek, cupping his face in her hands, her heart overflowing with gratitude. Thank you, General. Thank you so much. We've been waiting for this day for so long. Charles laughed. So, saying it wasn't just for Belgium was a lie. Lucia smiled and replied, no, General, it wasn't a lie. But if we can also contribute to Belgium, it will be even more perfect. Chapter 406 National Day. July 14th is France's National Day. On this day in 1789, the Parisian citizens staged an armed uprising and stormed the Bastille, an event of great symbolic significance, thus establishing it as a public holiday. Along the Champs-Élysées in the heart of Paris, crowds surged like a tide, waving red, white, and blue tricolor flags, discussing and gazing expectantly across the street. A few days earlier, they had read in the newspapers that Charles would be leading his 1st Tank Brigade and the 105th Infantry Regiment to be reviewed by the people of Paris. This instantly ignited the passion of the French people, who flocked to Paris from all directions, hoping to witness the prowess of Charles's elite troops. Residents of the town of Barrios also came, including Djoka and Camille, eager to see Charles fully armed with his troops. "He must be so handsome," Camille said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Maybe some girl will take a liking to him." Camille had deliberately dressed up today, a departure from her usual simple attire. Underneath a black silk cloak trimmed with fine fur, she wore a long silk skirt with red and white lace, making her look several years younger. Charles might not even recognize her. Djoka wore a black suit, a suit he'd bought for 1,500 francs, one he rarely wore. Although Djoka's income was now vastly different from before, he maintained his frugal lifestyle. He often told himself, "I have no right to be extravagant, this is all Charles's money." Therefore, every time he spent money, Djoka felt a pang of guilt. While waiting, Djoka felt a gaze from across the street. Looking up, he saw Grévy and Armand looking in their direction, both wearing suits and top hats, with canes tucked under their arms. Grévy lifted his hat, nodded to Djoka, and smiled in greeting. Armand gave a dismissive snort. "You don't need to do this, Grévy. You're after his son, not him. He's raised such a fine son, that's enough to earn him respect," Grévy replied. Armand smiled slightly. "Hearing you say that, I suddenly want to have more children, no matter how many children you have," Grévy answered. "They'll all inherit your womanizing ways," Armand chuckled. Suddenly, the sound of hooves striking the cobblestones caused a slight commotion among the crowd. French dragoons were marching in formation down the street, clad in black armor, carrying sabers, and wearing red feathered helmets. The lead rank consisted of 3 white horses, followed by several lead horses, and a few paces behind, the cavalry square. The cavalry moved with synchronized steps, appearing well-trained and imposing. The image above shows French dragoons. Due to their outstanding performance during the Napoleonic Wars and the continued tradition, dragoons are not only a branch of the military for France, but also a symbol of the nation and its power. Therefore, France has always maintained a dragoon contingent of several hundred men for parades and other ceremonies, even to this day. Normally, at this time, people would greet this cavalry symbolizing France with enthusiastic cheers, and the cavalrymen would always accept the honor as a matter of course. But this time, contrary to usual, people were silent. They seemed to want to reserve all their cheers for Charles and his troops. However, they soon discovered that there was nothing behind the cavalry except for an open-top car, slowly following behind. Keen-eyed people recognized Gallieri in the passenger seat and whispered among themselves, "What happened? Why isn't it Charles? Has the parade been cancelled? We don't see any troops, let alone tanks." Camille nervously looked around, unconsciously tightening his grip on Djoka's hand. Djoka gently reassured them, "Don't worry, he'll be all right. He's probably with his troops." At that moment, Gallieri's car stopped in front of the crowd. He stood up, glanced to both sides, and said with pride, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry that Charles and his troops couldn't be here, because at this very moment, the Second Battle of Cambrai has begun. Yes, Charles and his troops aren't here because they are attacking the enemy on the battlefield. Charles intends to present the French people with a very special parade in this way." The crowd paused for a moment, then erupted in cheers. Many people rushed to Djoka and Camille, eager to shake their hands, saying repeatedly, "Thank you, Charles is the hope of France. You have a wonderful son. I envy you, sir and madam. I'm so happy for you." Djoka and Camille responded with smiles, but the smiles were somewhat bitter, because it meant that Charles was on the battlefield again. On the other side, Grévy's face turned ashen upon hearing Gallieri's words. He glanced warily to both sides, pulled his hat down, and whispered to Armand, "Let's go." He then turned and pushed his way out of the crowd. Armand was somewhat bewildered, but he didn't think much of it and followed Grévy. "What's wrong?" Armand caught up with Grévy. "Charles used us," Grévy said. "What?" Armand looked puzzled. "Intelligence," Grévy quickened his pace. "Don't you understand? Charles knew the intelligence would get out. He used us. Armand froze. The cause was that Charles' worker training period was 3 months. A 3-month training period meant Charles planned to reclaim the steel mill before then, thus necessitating an operational plan targeting the mill. Greevy saw this as a perfect opportunity and passed the intelligence to the Germans. Now, Charles had suddenly launched an attack, not 3 months, but 1 month, and on National Day, when everyone expected Charles' troops to be reviewed, they attacked Cambrai. Was Charles intentionally misleading Greevy and then using him to mislead the Germans? Armand swallowed hard, quickly catching up with Greevy and whispering, "If Charles used us, does that mean he knows we?" Before he could finish, several men in black surrounded them, one hand in their pocket, clearly holding a pistol inside. The leader, a man in a suit with a mustache, casually approached, pulling an identification card from his pocket and waving it in front of Greevy. "Mr. Greevy, Mr. Armand, I'm from the 2nd Bureau of the General Staff. My name is Duro. Please come with me. There are some things I need to verify with you." Chapter 407. Can this fool the Germans? On the highway from Alaska to Cambrai, Foch sat in his speeding car, looking with interest at the documents in his hands, equipment information for the Charles forces. Cambrai was within Foch's Army Group North theater of operations, and Army Group North provided most of the Charles's support and supplies for operations there. Foch needed to know about their equipment. "Interesting," Foch said, flipping through the documents. "He's armed his entire force with vehicles, tanks, armored vehicles, cars, even artillery." Then Foch turned to Weigang, who was sitting beside him. "What do you think?" Weigang was Foch's chief of staff and a staunch supporter of Foch's offensive theory. He had gained Foch's favor 2 years prior and had since risen rapidly through the ranks, serving successively as chief of staff of the 20th Army, chief of staff of the 9th Army, and now chief of staff of Army Group North. The image above shows Maxime Weigang, Foch's chief of staff during World War I, and later commander-in-chief of the French Army and Minister of Defense of Vichy France during World War II. "Excuse my bluntness, General," Weigang replied expressionlessly, "I don't think this is the right approach. It's easily vulnerable to devastating enemy artillery fire." Foch nodded slightly in agreement. He had reviewed the data on those armored vehicles and artillery. They seemed extremely fragile. Especially those so-called truck-mounted guns, just simple combinations of trucks and artillery, with only the chassis reinforced. Foch couldn't help but picture the horrific scenes of these vehicles being blown up by enemy fire. Moreover, Weigang added, "I doubt the effectiveness of these vehicles on the battlefield. The other units are on foot, they can't keep up with Charles's forces. Does Charles really think he can defeat the Germans single-handedly with just over 10,000 men in these 2 units? Foch didn't refute, he didn't know how. Without the cooperation of other units, high speed also means rushing headlong into the enemy's encirclement, resulting in even faster death. However, Foch said thoughtfully, the fact is that he has consistently won, Colonel, never lost. This is probably because of our tactics, Weigang replied. Our tactics? Foch looked at Weigang in surprise. Did he also have doubts about the offensive theory? But Foch quickly realized he was wrong. Weigang explained, our tactics are no secret to the Germans. The Germans are using the same tactics against us. We know each other well because they know what we're going to do next. Foch chimed in, you mean, with the Germans already accustomed to our tactics, Charles suddenly adopted different tactics, leaving the Germans bewildered? Yes, Weigang nodded firmly. Peytain's defensive tactics were the same, they were also a different tactic from offensive warfare. After a pause, Weigang asserted, once the Germans get used to their tactics, that's when they'll fail. The battle will ultimately return to square one, and it can only be offensive. Foch fell silent. Although he had summarized and developed the offensive theory and previously believed in it wholeheartedly, after several conversations with Charles, he began to waver and no longer readily asserted which theory was correct. At this moment, the car turned into a mountain valley, and several fully armed guards approached. The car slowly stopped for inspection. Charles's habit was not to camp in towns, although it was more comfortable and convenient, but it also created opportunities for enemy decapitation and endangered civilians. Therefore, unless there were special circumstances, he always set up his command post in the forest. Charles had just received news of Greevy and Armand's arrest. He thought to himself that Greevy's intelligence and caution far exceeded Charles's expectations. Who would have thought that the book hidden in the safe was insignificant? It was a copy of Balzac's The Peasants, which perfectly suited Greavy's right-wing identity and ideals. But it was merely used to lure others to steal it and to warn Greavy. Every time Greavy put the book in the safe, he would carefully clip a few strands of hair to it, so he would know immediately if anyone touched it. Then he would pretend that the peasants was a codebook and send some insignificant telegrams. The real codebook was actually his personal diary. He would use old diary pages to send new entries, and have his confidants in Germany update the diaries simultaneously, so the codes changed almost daily and were never the same. But Greavy made a mistake. He forgot about Armand. Exploiting this loophole, everything fell into place. Harriet obtained intelligence from Armand, and the servant who had infiltrated Greavy's house photographed the diary pages, leaving Greavy with no secrets. This was a major victory for Charles, and the right wing would suffer a devastating blow. The party leader had actually colluded with the enemy? And the target of the attack was Charles? This was dragging the whole of France into fire. People even reasonably speculated that the right wing hoped for external intervention or colluded with external forces to achieve its goal of restoring the monarchy. And it was very likely that not only Greavy, but the entire right wing was a suspect. So, the right-wing members of parliament would keep a low profile, even if they didn't know Greavy's actions, and Schneider would distance himself from him for fear of getting involved. Then, it was time for Charles to step in. Just then, the communications officer pushed open the door and reported, "Brigadier General, General Foch is here." Before the words were finished, Foch entered with a smile, bowing low. "How are you, Brigadier General? Long time no see." Note, in 1910, the average height in France was 166.8 centimeters, and Foch was 175 centimeters tall, which was considered tall at the time. "All is well, General." Charles stepped forward and shook hands with him. Foch glanced curiously at the bunker, his tone appreciative. "You can share the hardships with your soldiers. That surpasses most French generals." "Actually, that's not the case, General," Charles said self-deprecatingly. "I'm just a bit timid. I don't dare risk being assassinated by living in town." Foch laughed heartily. Of course, he didn't believe Charles's reason was truly that. Then Foch steered the conversation to the main point. "You intentionally wanted everyone to believe that you and your troops would appear at the National Day parade, right?" "Yes," Charles nodded. "Will that fool the Germans?" Foch asked skeptically. "If it's just that, perhaps not," Charles replied. Foch sensed the implication in Charles's words. "Is there anything else?" Charles smiled. "Not only that, there's quite a bit." Charles had made considerable preparations for today's attack. Chapter 408 Armored Divisions and Mechanized Divisions. "All the steel mills I bought are on the Eastern Army Group's offensive direction," Charles said. "My bringing in steel workers to Schneider and training them was actually a hint." Foch gave a no. He had never heard of this before. Intelligence personnel would never report such a trivial matter to Foch, the deputy commander-in-chief. "I also went to Lagden 2 weeks ago," Charles said. Foch instantly understood. "You went to see Joffre?" Joffre's headquarters was currently located in Lagden, a small town in the northeast. "No," Charles shook his head in denial. "I just went for a look around." In principle, Charles should have gone, but he really didn't want to socialize with Joffre. Foch was taken aback, then nodded. "Yes, you don't need to see Joffre." Tigeny, standing to the side, looked completely bewildered. What did this have to do with the battle at hand? But the Colonel Foch brought suddenly realized, "You're hoping to use this to imply that you met with Joffre to discuss cooperation with an Army Group East." "Yes." Charles looked at the Colonel, a hint of surprise in his eyes. His reaction was quick enough. Foch introduced him. "This is my Chief of Staff, Weygand." Charles was taken aback. It was Weygand, the future commander-in-chief of the French army and the Minister of Defense after France's surrender in World War II. Seeing Charles's unusual expression, Weygand asked suspiciously, "Have we met before, Brigadier General?" "No," Charles quickly replied. "I only heard that you and General Foch planned operation towards the sea." Charles had originally wanted to find a battle example to flatter Weygand, but considering that he hadn't seen combat yet and had been working as a staff officer, he could only make up this excuse. Weygand was somewhat embarrassed. Towards the sea wasn't exactly a victory, it could even be considered a failure. It hadn't achieved the desired results. Foch broke the awkward silence, taking the briefcase from Weygand and waving a document at Charles. "This is your unit's equipment list, Brigadier General. There are some things I don't quite understand. Both the 1st Tank Brigade and the 105th Infantry Regiment are equipped with tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery. What's the difference between them? Foch suspected Charles had made a mistake, confusing a tank brigade with an infantry regiment. At least, Foch couldn't see the difference. Battlefield experience told Foch that each branch of the armed forces should have its own strengths and weaknesses. For example, artillery should focus on artillery, not try to be a jack of all trades. Of course there's a difference, General, Charles replied. In fact, I think they should have a different designation, because they can no longer be simply called Tank Brigade and Infantry Regiment. Foch agreed, especially since the 105th Infantry Regiment was heavily armed. Calling it an infantry regiment seemed excessive. What do you think they should be called? Foch asked. Without hesitation, Charles answered decisively, the 1st Armored Division and the 1st Mechanized Division. Charles had always built them according to the standards of armored and mechanized forces. Armored divisions have more tanks, primarily used to counter enemy tank forces or to break through enemy lines on the offensive direction. Mechanized divisions have fewer tanks and more artillery, but are always primarily infantry-based, capable of rapid transport and deployment to where needed in the shortest possible time. Foch nodded slightly. Although he still couldn't understand the purpose of such a force, he found Charles's approach novel. Weigand couldn't contain himself any longer. He took a small step forward, looking directly at Charles. Brigadier General, I noticed that each of your 2 divisions has over 500 vehicles of various types. Aren't you worried they'll suffer heavy losses under enemy artillery fire? Even tanks couldn't withstand the German 105mm cannons, could they? Therefore, on the battlefield, these 2 divisions would be swept away by the enemy like a whirlwind. Charles raised an eyebrow and replied, we'll crush the enemy's artillery before that. What? Weigand laughed. But our artillery is all 75mm guns. We've always been at a disadvantage in artillery. The enemy's artillery has a much longer range. We'll suffer heavy casualties before we even get close. The Northern Army Group knew this all too well. Adhering to their offensive theory, they frequently encountered this situation during offensives. That's why I need Saint-Chamond, Charles said, taking the document from Foch and pointing to Saint-Chamond on the list. It can do it, that's impossible. You're oversimplifying the battlefield. Weigand shook his head, disbelieving, a hint of sarcasm in his eyes. This guy's won too many easy battles, Weigand thought, he's oversimplifying everything. However, at that very moment, the communications soldier guard in the radio reported to Charles with a telegram, General, our troops have routed the enemy artillery. Colonel Brown requests further instructions. Break through decisively, Charles ordered, taking the telegram with a firm tone. Advance into enemy territory. Yes, sir. Charles handed the telegram to Foch. Just as I said, the armored divisions have torn through the enemy lines ahead. They've done it. Foch glanced at the telegram, then passed it to shocked Weigand. Weigand looked at the telegram again and again, his face still full of disbelief. He looked at Charles with a mixture of doubt and skepticism, asking with difficulty, You? How did you do that? This was also what Foch wanted to ask. The disadvantage in artillery had always been a major concern for the French army. Foch and Weigand even believed that the reason the offensive theory was mired in problems wasn't because the theory itself was wrong, but because the direction of artillery development was flawed. If Charles could solve this problem and suppress the German 105mm guns with 75mm guns, it would be tantamount to paving a broad road for the collapsing offensive theory. It's simple, Charles replied easily. Intelligence, air power, and the Saint-Chamond, the White Lady was in charge of intelligence gathering, knowing in advance the German artillery positions or suspected artillery positions. Then, the Caproni bombers, under the cover and guidance of the Camel fighters, launched a volley at the German artillery positions. Taking advantage of the German artillery's preoccupation, the 1st Panzer Division launched its attack. Tanks led the way, followed by armored vehicles loaded with infantry, and then 50 upgraded Saint-Chamond tanks. Before the German artillery could react, the Saint-Chamond tanks had entered an 8-kilometer range where they could retaliate. They advanced while fighting, coordinating with fighters and bombers, successfully suppressing 2 German 105mm artillery regiments. Foch and Weigand exchanged bewildered glances. What seemed like an insurmountable problem to them was handled with ease by Charles. Chapter 409 Widened Trench. Charles believed that attacking from Cambrai towards Belgium was the best option. The main reason was Belgium's coastal location, allowing Charles to potentially encircle the German forces with a single, flanking force. Furthermore, Armored and mechanized units could advance along roads to capture key Belgian cities, from Mons to Halle, then to the capital Brussels, and finally to the fortified city of Antwerp. This route not only had roads facilitating rapid mechanized advances but also railways for resupply. As the two armies advanced, supplies and reinforcements would be continuously transported forward by rail. Historically, the British campaign at Cambrai had failed due to logistical difficulties, and Charles certainly wouldn't repeat that mistake. The image above is a map of Belgium. The red arrows start at Cambrai, pointing towards Brussels and Antwerp, with Ypres in the upper left corner, labeled Ypres on the map. Another reason was that Charles's intelligence agency, the White Lady, was primarily composed of Belgians. Without a doubt, they would be as enthusiastic as Lucia were, throwing themselves into the task with 200% enthusiasm after learning of Charles's plan to retake Belgium. Furthermore, Belgium was their home turf, and the Lady in White was intimately familiar with the terrain, allowing Charles easy access to accurate intelligence and the assistance of local guerrillas and civilians. The accuracy of the intelligence directly determined whether the bombers and the Saint-Samans could deliver bombs and shells into the enemy's artillery positions. The guerrillas, besides cooperating with the French army, could provide them with more accurate and detailed intelligence in real time. The civilians could reduce the French army's supply difficulties and even provide reinforcements. Everything seemed perfect. However, the German Second Army stationed on the Cambrai front thought differently, including Major General Nicholas, commander of the 1st Tank Division. On the edge of the Barung Forest, in a semi-barred bunker concealed by trees and grass, Major General Nicholas stared blankly at the documents before him. During this time, Major General Nicholas had been desperately reinforcing the 1st Tank Division's strength. The First Battle of Cambrai inflicted heavy casualties on his troops. Only 13 Upper Silesia tanks remained, all of them damaged, and perhaps none were actually combat-ready. "We are now a tank division without tanks," Major General Nicholas said dejectedly. But only he knew that this had nothing to do with tanks. Tanks would certainly be lost on the battlefield, and they could be produced again. These tanks, converted from tractor chassis, were quick to produce, requiring little time and cost. The key issue is that Major General Nicholas didn't know how to defeat the Char A1. Artillery accuracy was low, although the caliber was larger, the armor was thin, and in a head-on confrontation, they might not be a match for the Char A1. Machine guns couldn't penetrate its armor. It seemed only one outcome: tank after tank would be destroyed. If this problem wasn't solved, sending more tanks wouldn't change the result. Therefore, even after more than 50 tanks were sent to the rear, Major General Nicholas remained unhappy. Just as Major General Nicholas was frowning in thought, Irwin walked up to him and stood at attention to salute. The image above shows Irwin during World War I. Irwin was a capable subordinate of Major General Nicholas, and his performance on the battlefield was astonishing. In his first battle, he led 3 soldiers to defeat an attack by 20 French soldiers and captured 3 Frenchmen with a rifle that had run out of bullets. Later, as commander of a mountain battalion, he led his troops on a 50-hour march along a little-known mountain path, miraculously capturing more than 5,000 enemy soldiers and seizing 30 artillery pieces. Because of these outstanding performances, Major General Nicholas appointed Captain Irwin as commander of the 1st Tank Battalion, leading 30 tanks, which was nearly half of the 1st Tank Division's existing tank force. "General," Irwin reported, stepping forward, "I still believe that Charles is likely to use our lines as a breakthrough point." "No, Irwin," Major General Nicholas frowned, "I've said it many times, there's no doubt about it, but the terrain nearby is very suitable for tank warfare," Irwin insisted, "and vehicles too. I've heard that Charles has been replenishing his troops with various vehicles." "I'll say it again," Major General Nicholas impatiently interrupted Irwin. "Charles' troops will join the French Eastern Army Group, and they might launch an attack around Oviedo. That's a ruse, General. All intelligence points to that." Major General Nicholas raised his voice, tapping his finger heavily on the table. "Charles' steel mill is there, and he's met with Joffre. The French and Italians are in cahoots. They plan to attack us from there. That's what Charles wants us to see," Irwin argued. "Similar things have happened several times before, General. Charles always cleverly disguises his true operational intentions." Seeing that Major General Nicholas didn't answer, Irwin added, "If Charles leads us to believe his troops are in Army Group East, then he certainly won't be there. He'll be in Army Group North, and of Army Group North's offensive front, only Cambrai is suitable for tank and vehicle attacks." Major General Nicholas sighed and shook his head, saying, You might have forgotten something, Erwin. How far can an attack from here go? Ypres? You know the terrain there. Charles's tanks and vehicles will be stuck there, General, Erwin said, pointing to the map. I don't think he'll attack Ypres. Instead, he'll advance along the roads and railways directly into the heart of Belgium. We have very few troops in that area. There's only one reserve division in Brussels, and only one newly recruited regiment in Antwerp. I heard they were training on how to use rifles. God, Major General Nicholas said. Brussels is 100 kilometers from Cambrai, Erwin. How long will it take them to get there? Erwin answered Major General Nicholas, word by word. If no one stops them, it might only take 2 days, or even 1 day. Major General Nicholas fell silent. The troops, equipped with a large number of vehicles, advanced unimpeded along the road and would indeed arrive in a day or two. Finally, Major General Nicholas asked Erwin helplessly, even if you're right, how do you plan to stop them? Erwin replied, I think we should build trenches to stop the enemy tanks. Trenches? Major General Nicholas looked at Erwin with doubt. What kind of trenches can stop their tanks? Why trenches? Erwin said confidently. Chapter 410 Battles always appear suddenly. Why the trenches? Nicholas was taken aback. Just that simple. Yes, Erwin analyzed. I've observed the Char tanks. The Char A1 can pass through our trenches because of its tailhook. If we widen the trenches, their tanks might not be able to pass. Just possibly. I'm not sure, General, Erwin replied. But we should try. It's better than doing nothing. Major General Nicholas nodded slightly. Let him do whatever he wants. There won't be any losses, as long as he doesn't bother me again. So, Major General Nicholas relayed Erwin's suggestion to Lieutenant General Georgian, commander of the Second Army. Although Lieutenant General Georgian didn't take the suggestion seriously, he passed on the order, thinking it was worth a try. Erwin actually did more than that. He also reinforced a barbed wire in front of the trenches and led his men to open up passages on the battlefield. These passages extended from the Berlin forest, where the tank battalion was located, all the way to the rear of the trenches, and tank bunkers were also constructed. Erwin ingeniously arranged the tank cover so that the Upper Silesia tanks faced the enemy sideways. This was to allow the main gun and the 2 machine guns at the front and rear to work simultaneously. As long as they were all rotated to face the enemy, all 3 gun turrets could fire at once. Erwin was satisfied with this. He felt he could hold off Charles's charge, as long as they dared to come. This tactic was indeed feasible, Charles thought to himself with a silent approval when he received the telegram about these arrangements. If it weren't for the White Lady having infiltrated the German army and transmitting intelligence in real time, the 1st Panzer Division might have been caught off guard. Digging wide trenches seems simple, but it is essentially a primitive anti-tank trench, which remains a challenge even in modern times. The only way to cross it is to fill the trench. While the French were filling the trenches, the German tanks could continue firing from within their bunkers. The 57mm guns were enough to penetrate the frontal armor of the Charles A1 at close range, and the 2 machine guns at the front and rear could wipe out large numbers of charging and trench-filling infantry. But now that he knew the Germans had made these preparations, Charles knew how to deal with them. On French National Day, the Second Army stationed on the Cambrai line seemed relaxed. They assumed the French wouldn't choose this day to attack, especially since they'd heard Charles's troops would be in the parade. Soldiers lit cigarettes for each other, grumbling idly. It seems our biggest worry right now is Charles's troops. Yes, whenever his troops appear, we're always defeated, without exception. It's frustrating, but it's true. His troops are completely different from the rest of the French army. I wonder why the French don't all train like him. Prochnow, someone immediately pointed out. Do you want the rest of the French army to be like Charles's? The soldiers chuckled, secretly relieved that the French hadn't adopted Charles's tactics as they'd hoped. Some still couldn't understand why the French didn't do it that way. Hey, Captain, the soldiers waved to Erwin, who was peering out to survey the terrain. These past few days, Erwin of the tank battalion had become a regular in the trenches. Watch out for snipers, Captain, a mud-covered veteran warned. They always find you when you least expect it. Erwin ducked back, put away his binoculars, and slowly walked among the soldiers, taking a cigarette offered to him. He casually asked, any new developments? No, Captain. The veteran lit a match and handed it to him, answering as Erwin bent down to light his cigarette. The French have all gone to storm the Bastille. The soldiers laughed. Erwin smiled slightly, exhaled a puff of smoke, and instructed, stay alert. Battles always break out unexpectedly. Yes, Captain, the soldiers replied one after another, but no one took his words to heart. However, just as Irwin's figure disappeared around the corner of the trench, the rumble of an engine suddenly came from the sky. Everyone's expression changed, and they quickly stood up and looked up at the sky. Irwin ran back quickly, raised his binoculars, and climbed onto the platform. The sky was a dark mass of planes, and Irwin immediately recognized them as Charles's Caproni bombers. Damn it, Irwin cursed. I knew it. This is Charles's target. Without hesitation, Irwin put away his binoculars and shouted to his soldiers, "Notify your officers, prepare for battle." The soldiers responded, quickly tossing aside their unfinished cigarettes, grabbing their rifles, stepping onto the ramps, and lying prone at the edge of the trenches. The communications soldier hurriedly grabbed his rifle and went to find their commander. Irwin crouched low and ran towards his unit, worried that the bomber's target was the 1st Tank Division. If he was right, everything would be over. However, as he ran, Irwin glanced at the sky and noticed that the bombers seemed to be heading in the wrong direction. Following their direction, Irwin discovered that their target was a 105mm howitzer positioned 4 kilometers away. "God, they're finished," Irwin whispered in alarm. "The Char has located the howitzer positions." Sure enough, bombs rained down on the howitzer positions like a cascade of leaves. Boom, 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 boom. Bright flashes and smoke rose simultaneously from the artillery positions, explosions echoing like the whispers of demons, shaking the entire forest. However, after the explosions, not all the bombers dropped their bombs. Some remained circling overhead, seemingly waiting for something. Irwin understood the significance and quickly pulled signal flags from his backpack, waving them towards the tank battalion. Dozens of Upper Silesia tanks slowly emerged from the forest, quickly taking up positions in their bunkers as in regular drills, ready for battle. Just as Irwin had guessed, the rumble of tank engines came from the smoke on the other side of the trenches, and Char A1 tanks appeared on the ground, their short-barrel guns swaying from side to side, seemingly searching for their targets. "Aim!" Irwin shouted. He could no longer place any hope in the artillery. The moment it opened fire, the circling bombers would spot them and blast them to smithereens. This was the disadvantage of lacking anti-aircraft fire. Aircraft could wait over targets for extended periods, provided they had enough fuel. However, Irwin found his tank tactics were also ineffective. The enemy artillery fire was too intense. Wave after wave, the Upper Silesia tanks were often destroyed before they even saw their targets, despite being concealed in tank bunkers. Chapter 411 The Pulse of War. Sorry, I only have one chapter today due to work. I'm still a junior high school homeroom teacher this year, and I've been quite busy with work since the start of the school year. Because of writing a novel, I repeatedly applied to not be a homeroom teacher at the beginning of the year. But it's a vicious cycle. The more you do it, the better you do it, the harder it is to escape it. You're forced to do it every year. If you completely give up, in a couple of years no one will dare to let you be a homeroom teacher anymore. Charles was confident about this battle. One reason was that the French army had previously captured the Upper Silesia tank, and Charles had tested it, obtaining complete performance data. The Upper Silesia tank had 14mm of frontal armor, which the Char A1's 37mm gun could penetrate at a distance of about 350 meters. Conversely, the Char A1 had added 45mm of frontal armor, and the Upper Silesia's 57mm gun needed to get close to about 200 meters to barely penetrate it. Note, at this time, there were no dedicated armor-piercing shells. Otherwise, the armor-piercing capability of the 57mm caliber guns wouldn't have been so weak. Knowing this, the tanks of the 1st Panzer Division advanced to within about 200 meters of the enemy trenches and temporarily stopped, forming an ironclad defense line in front of the German lines. They didn't waste time aiming at the enemy tanks and 77mm field guns, but instead locked onto the machine gun positions and infantry on the trenches. This was because most of the German tanks and artillery were hidden in bunkers, with only a small portion exposed, making it very difficult to destroy them with the accuracy of the Charles A1. The German tanks were countered by the Saint-Chamond and truck-mounted guns following closely behind. The truck-mounted guns played a major role. Tigny's 1st Mechanized Division was equipped with 80 truck-mounted guns, which quickly followed and prepared to fire after the Saint-Chamond forced the German artillery to retreat. This process could be completed in a few minutes. All that was needed was to find a flat area or level the ground, then the trucks would turn around, and the 75mm guns behind them would point their muzzles at the enemy positions. More complex and crucial was the preparation work done before the truck-mounted artillery reached its combat position. Artillery observers advance alongside the infantry, using binoculars to locate enemy tanks and calculate their coordinates. Signalmen quickly laid telephone lines to the artillery observers. Originally, Charles planned to use radios, but at that time, radio quality was poor and easily interfered with, and communication was extremely difficult on the front lines amidst constant gunfire. It was only suitable for transmitting information between relatively stable command posts. Telephones were also problematic because lines were easily severed by artillery shells or run over by their own vehicles. Charles's solution was no expense spared. He assigned 2 communications squads to each artillery observation group, each responsible for setting up a line. An emergency communications company was also added. This company used armored vehicles and sidecars equipped with rollers adapted to their speed. As the vehicles moved forward, the lines were laid behind them, allowing for a connection of 3 or 4 kilometers in as little as 5 minutes. This perfectly solved the coordination problem between frontline infantry and rear artillery. So, artillery observers reported the coordinates of the tanks ahead via telephone, and the artillery behind them fired shells based on these coordinates, eliminating the targets one by one. The 75mm guns could fire 30 rounds per minute at their maximum rate of fire, and even at a normal rate of a dozen rounds per minute, the combined firepower of 80 truck-mounted guns was terrifying. Shells exploded one after another on the German positions, quickly turning the German tanks into wreck. Meanwhile, the German tanks achieved almost nothing. Their shells only flashed briefly before the Charles A1, then continued firing at the German lines. Irwin was nearly driven to despair by this scene. This was one of the few battles he had fought since joining the war where he truly needed to figure out how to resolve the situation. The other was the Charles counter-offensive at Cambrai. After a moment of silence, Irwin suddenly shouted, "Retreat! Retreat!" He realized that defeat was inevitable, and continuing like this would only increase casualties and serve no purpose. The signalman relayed the message in time, but only 8 tanks managed to make it to the retreat route, 2 of which were destroyed along the way. The rear armor of the Upper Silesia tank was only 5mm thick. Even if a shell missed its direct hit and only shrapnel struck, it could penetrate and damage the engine. Irwin returned to the forest where the tank division was hiding in a sidecar motorcycle, covered in dust and his face blackened by shell smoke. His once confident eyes were now dull and lifeless. Major General Nicholas paced anxiously in front of the bunker. As soon as he saw Irwin approach, he rushed forward and asked, "How is the situation?" "The situation is very bad, General." Irwin shook his head helplessly. "Charles is much stronger than I thought. The defenses I organized are no match for him." Major General Nicholas was stunned. This didn't sound like Irwin at all. This guy always had an arrogant air about him. He never admitted defeat and never took anyone seriously, including Major General Nicholas. But now, he was as dejected as a defeated rooster. "Cheer up, Captain," Major General Nicholas said. "We haven't lost yet. At least you guessed Charles's intentions correctly, and only you did. Now, I need you to guess what he'll do next and stop him before he does." "Yes, General." Irwin swallowed hard, then gritted his teeth and forced himself to look at a map spread out on a wheel. "General, we may only have one option." Irwin pointed to the map and said, "The town of Valois, about 30 kilometers away, is the only way to Brussels. There's a highway bridge there. If we can hold that bridge or blow it up, we can delay the enemy's movement." Nicholas didn't hesitate any longer. He glanced at the map and immediately ordered, "The entire army retreats to Valois." Full speed ahead, the 1st Tank Division sprang into action. Although they only had 38 tanks, some of which had just been repaired, no one knew if they could even reach Valois. At the 1st Mechanized Division headquarters, after receiving a call about the successful capture of the German lines, Charles said to Foch, "I'm sorry, sir, I may not be able to entertain you." Foch noticed the guards organizing documents and equipment and asked curiously, "You plan to advance with the troops?" "Yes." Charles nodded. "No." A hint of surprise flashed in Foch's eyes. "You don't need to do that, Brigadier General. You know this infiltration mission is very dangerous. One wrong move and we could be surrounded by the enemy. Precisely because it's dangerous, I must go with the troops," Charles replied firmly. "Otherwise, what reason do we have to ask our soldiers to charge into enemy positions regardless of the danger?" Foch paused, then silently patted Charles on the shoulder. "You're right. I'll await your victory, Thank you, General. Charles shook hands with Foch. Charles and his entourage left, leaving only Foch and Weigang in the empty headquarters. Foch asked Weigang thoughtfully, "Now, do you still think his theory is wrong?" Weigang remained silent. Compared to staff officers who only formulated battle plans from the rear, Charles was a commander who could throw himself into the battlefield. This meant he could connect theory with practice, that he could grasp the pulse of war, and that he could choke the enemy. Therefore, although Weigang was unwilling to admit it, he vaguely understood in his heart that he might be the one in the wrong. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 412 Mobile Defense. The German 1st Tank Division sped towards the town of Valo on the highway. The Upper Silesia tanks had a normal cruising speed of 12 km per hour, although they were designed to reach a top speed of 16 km per hour, but this was only for unavoidable combat situations. Otherwise, they would likely overheat and explode within 15 minutes, potentially causing an accident. Even during normal travel, 11 tanks had to be abandoned due to malfunctions. The 30-kilometer journey took over 2 hours, with the drivers working without a break. They were exhausted and nearly collapsed before even reaching Valo. Tanks of this era lacked power assistance, driving them was purely physical labor, and drivers had to endure the noise and suffocating air inside the tank. Irwin traveled in Major General Nicholas's car the entire way, slowly following the tanks while simultaneously formulating battle plans using maps. The highway bridge is built over a ravine that is more than 7 meters deep and over 10 meters wide, Irwin said. I used it as a target when I was the battalion commander of the Mountain Battalion, so I am familiar with the terrain in that area. Major General Nicholas stared at the map, seemingly trying to find the end of the ravine. It's actually not long, Irwin explained, drawing a rough line on the map with his finger. Only a little over 200 meters. It's not marked on the map. It connects to mountains that tanks can't cross. If we don't go through here, we have to detour over 100 kilometers from the Charleroi direction. Major General Nicholas was relieved. This is a good opportunity. Our tanks can hide on the other side of the bridge and open fire when the enemy crosses. General, Irwin interrupted, I don't think this approach might be effective against the Char forces. Major General Nicholas looked at Irwin questioningly. The highway bridge can only accommodate one tank at a time, Captain. Even if the Char A1 is powerful, it can't withstand a simultaneous attack from dozens of other tanks. Besides, if a tank is destroyed on the bridge, their advance will be blocked. Major General Nicholas felt this was a near-perfect battle plan. Irwin shook his head again. I thought so too before, Irwin said calmly but helplessly. That's what I did on the front lines. Major General Nicholas suddenly realized that the trenches Irwin dug were like ravines, and the enemy's sandbag-filled trenches were like highway bridges. They would be just as vulnerable to the concentrated fire of Irwin's tank battalion. However, Irwin suffered a humiliating defeat. Major General Nicholas asked curiously, how did they do it? Irwin's answer was simple and clear, artillery. Their artillery seems to have eyes. They can accurately pinpoint the location of our tanks from several kilometers away. I think they deployed a large number of artillery observers on the front lines, achieving effective infantry-artillery coordination. Irwin's specialty was artillery. He had served in the 49th Field Artillery Regiment before becoming the commander of a mountain battalion, and he had a deep understanding of this. Major General Nicholas was silent for a moment, then said thoughtfully, so, our tanks will be destroyed one by their artillery, and then their tanks will cross the bridge. Yes, Irwin sighed softly. I always thought the gap between us and Charles was in equipment. But now I realize that's far from the truth. What do you mean? Major General Nicholas asked. They are a unified force, General, Irwin replied. The Air Force cooperates with the artillery to suppress our 105mm howitzers. The artillery cooperates with the tanks to suppress our tanks. The infantry cooperates with the tanks in their attacks. Each branch plays to its strengths and compensates for the weaknesses of others. But we fight separately. Major General Nicholas finished Irwin's sentence. Irwin hummed in agreement, a sense of powerlessness welling up within him. What truly filled him with despair was not Charles's bombers, nor Charles's tanks, nor even the defeat just now, but the coordination between the various branches of the French army. How did Charles know these tactics and train its troops to be such a unified whole? Such an army is invincible. One division would lead to two, and then more and more. The German army, which only knew how to dig trenches, was utterly helpless against them. This war was destined to be lost. Major General Nicholas seemed to see through Irwin's thoughts. He said expressionlessly, "You're thinking too far ahead, Captain. What we need to do is fight this battle well." Then his tone turned serious. "If that's the case, we only have one option, blow up the bridge." However, blowing up the bridge was not the best option. The German army had a large number of vehicles, sidecars, and artillery. Blowing up the bridge meant that only soldiers could cross, and everything else would be left on the other side of the ditch. Irwin thought for a moment and replied, "We might have another option." As he spoke, Irwin pointed to the town of Valois, about a mile away on the map. "We might be able to hide the tanks here." Nicholas immediately understood Irwin's intention. If the tanks were hidden in Valois, not only would the French army not be able to see them, but they would also be hesitant to bomb them indiscriminately, because many Belgian civilians lived there. However, "What's the use?" Nicholas retorted. "We can't penetrate the Char-A1 at this distance, we can only watch them cross the bridge." "No, General," Irwin replied. "When a dozen or so Char-A1 tanks cross the bridge, we will launch a sudden counterattack." Major General Nicholas stared blankly at Irwin. Was this guy crazy? A counterattack? Close combat with a Char-A1? But thinking about it, Major General Nicholas felt that this might be the only feasible tactic. Once the Upper Silesia tanks were mixed with the Char-A1s, the enemy's artillery would be ineffective. At this point, the German tanks would outnumber the enemy, even using a top speed of 16 km per hour to circle around to the rear of the Char-A1s. Then, whether it was tank guns or K rounds, they could penetrate the Char-A1s. As long as they won the battle, the wreckage of the Char-A1's tanks would block the highway bridge, rendering the enemy unable to move. Thinking this, Major General Nicholas chose to accept this bold operational plan. "I will incorporate the other tanks into your tank battalion," Major General Nicholas said. "You will command the tanks, and I will command the infantry. If possible, it would be best to find some artillery support." "Yes, General," Irwin replied. He realized he had made a mistake earlier. He should have used this mobile defense instead of placing the tanks in bunkers on the defensive line. Tanks have tracks and engines. They are for mobility, not turrets. However, what Irwin didn't expect was that he would never have the opportunity to test this tactic. Chapter 413 Belgian Partisans. Valois is a town located in southwestern Belgium, only 5 kilometers from the Franco-Belgian border. Belgium is mostly plains, with mountains only in the south, and Valois sits precisely on the boundary between the mountains and plains. A winding road stretches at the foot of the mountains, with a river on one side and a 100-meter-high forest on the other. A bridge spans a ravine between the two mountains, connecting two sections of the road directly to the town on the other side. Along the roadside, elm trees stretch out their lush green branches, a gentle breeze blows, and a few golden leaves flutter down onto the road, adding a touch of tranquility to the summer scene. Perhaps knowing the importance of the highway bridge, the Germans had set up a checkpoint there, stationing a guard platoon to ensure its security. The guards were shouting at the tractor that had nearly broken down on the bridge, "Hey, move it now, or we'll push it off the bridge." The tractor driver, sweating profusely, fiddled with the tractor's front end and replied, "It's broken, sir." "Does anyone know how to fix a tractor?" the German lieutenant answered. "We only know how to kill. If you don't move it in 5 minutes, I'd be happy to help you." The German soldiers chuckled, and several of them lit cigarettes. A short soldier emerged from a phone booth and reported to the lieutenant, "I can fix tractors, sir." The lieutenant raised an eyebrow. "Yes, how could I forget you?" The short soldier was named Khalil, who had grown up on a farm and had worked with tractors since childhood, only enlisting a few months earlier. The lieutenant gestured towards the tractor. "Go check it out. If you can't fix it, let us know. We must keep the road clear." "Understood, sir." Khalil straightened up and saluted, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and ran towards the tractor. Khalil politely asked the driver, "Has this happened before?" "No, sir," the driver replied. "Never before." "Have you checked the spark plugs?" Khalil asked, taking a wrench from the toolbox and walking towards the front of the tractor. "Or the ignition coil?" He froze before he could finish. The driver wasn't holding a tool, but a pistol, pointed at him in a blind spot. "Do as I say, lad," the driver whispered, "or you'll be dead a moment before me." "Understand, Callil didn't doubt the driver's words. His eyes were filled with murderous intent, and sweat beaded on his forehead. He seemed prepared to die with his driver. "Yes, sir," Callil replied nervously, wondering why the driver was doing this. The next second, Callil had his answer, because the rumble of a tank engine could be heard from the other side of the road. This was a premeditated plan, Callil thought, but he was helpless. Seeing a tank approaching from the other side of the road, the lieutenant, worried about being reprimanded, immediately tensed up. He threw away his cigarette butt, looked at the tractor, and called out, "Callil, it might take 10 minutes, sir." Callil poked his head out. "It'll be done soon," the lieutenant sighed. Even if he pushed the tractor off the bridge now, it would be too late. Waiting 10 minutes might be a better option. The tank rattled along the road to the checkpoint, stopping amidst a cloud of dust and exhaust fumes, carrying a strong smell of gasoline. A lieutenant poked his head out of the tank and shouted, "What happened?" "You just watch this happen, tractor malfunction." The lieutenant quickly replied. "It'll be fixed in 10 minutes, Lieutenant, I promise." One tank after another came to a stop, like a long snake winding around the mountainside. Major General Nicholas's car was stuck between the tanks, unable to move forward or backward. Just as he was wondering what was going on, a communications soldier ran up to report, "General, the tractor ahead has broken down and will take 10 minutes. Major General Nicholas frowned slightly and gave a blank hum. Irwin peered ahead, then looked to both sides, his expression changing. He ordered, "Charge." "What?" the communications soldier asked, puzzled. Major General Nicholas was taken aback at first, but immediately realized this might be an ambush. He quickly repeated Irwin's order, "Charge. Now. Push the tractor under the bridge." "Yes, General," the communications soldier replied, jogging forward. But it was too late. Suddenly, grenades were thrown from the woods several body lengths above them on the right. They tumbled through the air, their handles trailing terrifying blue smoke. Almost simultaneously, gunfire and artillery fire erupted. The machine gun was a light machine gun, the St. Etienne, easy to carry and with good sustained firepower. A hail of bullets swept through the guards and soldiers, who fell screaming in pools of blood before they even understood what was happening. The cannon was a 37mm gun. Irwin had the sound etched into his mind, and its distinctive roar immediately triggered his sensitive nerves. The 1st Tank Division was finished. The armor of the Upper Silesia tanks couldn't withstand close-range 37mm fire from either side. Irwin grabbed Major General Nicholas and rolled him to the inside. Major General Nicholas was about to jump to the left, towards the river, because it was far from the road. Only after taking cover on the inside did he realize Irwin was right. The inside was a blind spot for enemy fire, and even grenades couldn't be thrown there. Grenades exploded with a boom among the crowd and tanks, and the Germans screamed in agony. But the Germans didn't collapse. Well-trained, they returned fire at their commander's shouts, and the tanks immediately turned their guns and machine guns towards the enemy. Then an awkward scene unfolded. The tanks couldn't attack the enemy at higher ground. They became piles of scrap metal, utterly useless pieces of scrap metal, offering virtually no defense, because they were being targeted by 37mm guns that could easily penetrate their armor. "Charles, it's Charles." Irwin's eyes flashed with anger, his teeth clenched in hatred. Major General Nicholas initially didn't understand. What did this have to do with Charles? These were clearly Belgian partisans. The next second, Major General Nicholas understood. The people might be Belgian partisans, but the equipment, tactics, and battle plan were all Charles's. Irwin was right, this was indeed Charles's battle plan. Especially the use of the elevation difference to evade tank fire, forcing the Germans into passive defensive posture, was based on the Upper Silesia tank's limited field of fire of only plus or minus 20 degrees. Most tanks had a field of fire of around 35 degrees. For example, the Charles A1 had a field of fire of plus or minus 20 to plus or minus 35 degrees. The Upper Silesia tank has a machine gun turret at both the front and rear, limiting its firing arc to plus or minus 20 degrees. With this knowledge and the right equipment, guerrillas could easily take on tank divisions. Chapter 414. It's actually a cannon. This guerrilla unit, the Belgian National Front, numbered over 500 men, mostly wounded and stragglers left behind by the retreating Belgian army. Their military skill far surpassed that of ordinary guerrillas. They fought with remarkable discipline, deploying 4 37mm guns at each end in front, blocking the road after destroying the tanks at both ends, trapping even the undamaged tanks in the middle. Taking advantage of their position, the guerrillas unleashed a barrage of grenades and bullets at the German troops. The Germans were thrown into chaos. Initially attempting to regain their footing, they completely collapsed and scattered after 2 gasoline-powered vehicles exploded. Major General Irwin and Nicholas escaped the ambush under the cover of their guards. Without hesitation, Major General Nicholas immediately ordered his men to gather the fleeing troops. The enemy doesn't have many troops. Major General Nicholas gripped his pistol, watching warily in the direction from which the gunfire came. As long as we take back the high ground, we can still maintain the initiative. We must at least blow up the highway bridge, Major General Nicholas thought, otherwise Charles's troops could advance all the way to Brussels. That's the Belgian capital, and it holds great symbolic significance for Belgium. Irwin remained silent. Major General Nicholas's consideration was correct. By gathering the routed soldiers and adding the infantry following from the rear, they could muster at least 1,000 or 2,000 men. It wouldn't be difficult for them to attack the partisans. However, had Charles not considered this? Just as he was thinking this, the sound of engines that terrified Irwin rang out again in the sky. Then Irwin understood what was happening. "No, General," Irwin said, "we can't do it. If we don't want to be captured, we should change course now." As he spoke, bombers emerged from the clouds, descending at low altitude and hurling bombs at the German troops on the highway. Unlike other wealthy people who prefer living in the 15th and 16th wards, James prefers to live in the city center. He believes that it is more convenient for getting around and running errands in the city center, and he can also get information earlier and faster. That day, James was feeling unwell and stayed in his villa in the 2nd ward all day. Around 10 a.m., he felt better and then had the butler bring breakfast to his bedroom. The butler placed breakfast on the small table by the window, and as James habitually did, put a newspaper beside it. "There's an express edition today, sir." "Oh," James replied, unsurprised, his tone tinged with sarcasm. "Is it about Charles's heroic figure at the parade?" "No, sir," the butler answered. "Charles didn't participate in the parade, nor did his troops. They're launching an attack on the Germans in Cambrai." James froze, instantly losing interest in his breakfast. He quickly grabbed the newspaper, which read, "At 9 o'clock, when the parade began, Charles's troops launched an attack on the German lines." James scoffed, "Trying to break through the German lines with only tanks and no artillery? What's the difference between that and suicide?" James had always assumed Charles would wait until his new artillery was in mass production before launching a counterattack. After all, his factories were working overtime. This was a mistake Charles had made, James thought. Charles wanted to demonstrate his strength to the French people on National Day. The Germans would teach him a lesson. However, the butler hesitated before answering. "Sir, I heard that Charles's army has broken through the German lines." "The newspapers are outdated." "Broken through?" James glanced at the butler, then shook his head firmly. "No, impossible. It's a rumor. People think Charles can't possibly fail." So, the phone rang, interrupting James. He got up and picked up the receiver. Pauline's voice came through, saying only 2 words, "Sir, bad news." James's heart sank. He had a bad feeling. "Yes," Pauline replied, "perhaps you've heard that Charles has broken through the German lines." James sighed softly, acknowledging the truth. At the same time, he felt a little relieved. "This isn't bad news, it has nothing to do with us." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the phone before he slowly added, "Charles used the Saint-Chamond to break through the German lines." "What? The Saint-Chamond?" James exploded instantly, asking sharply, "You're not kidding, are you?" "The Saint-Chamond is impossible, sir. Every word I said is true," Pauline said with a helpless tone. "It's the Saint-Chamond." Charles simply removed the machine gun and made slight modifications, using it as artillery to attack the enemy's 105mm howitzer positions. James stood there stunned, unable to react for a long time. He had been struggling with this issue for some time, thinking about Charles's intentions in buying the Saint-Chamond whenever he had a spare moment, but he still couldn't figure it out. Now, with Pauline's explanation, he finally understood what was going on. Used as artillery? He actually used the Saint-Chamond as artillery. Suddenly, he felt dizzy, and if the butler hadn't stepped forward to support him in time, he would have fainted to the ground. "How could I not have thought of that?" James plopped down on the bed, muttering to himself, "It's not a tank, it's a cannon. God, I invented it," and then handed it over to Charles. "That bastard, he always knew." James buried his face in his hands in frustration. Once James had calmed down a bit, the butler handed him the microphone again. "Sir, Pauline seems to have something to say." James took the microphone listlessly, and heard Pauline's low voice. "Sir, Grevy and Armand have been arrested." James gave a curt hum. This was nothing serious. "You know what to do," James replied. "Leave no trace, understand?" "Yes, sir." That afternoon, Major Dura received shocking news. Charles's grandfather, Francis, was found dead in his bedroom, the cause of death being a heart attack. "This can't be a heart attack, Major," Gabriel said hastily. "We just arrested Grevy, and everyone knows Francis and Grevy were very close." "Is that so?" Major Dura coldly interrupted Gabriel. "If there's a killer, who do you think did it?" Gabriel opened his mouth, but hesitated to speak. Everyone knew it was James. Francis was James's intermediary between the right wing and the right wing. With Francis dead, the trail went cold. But this was just speculation. Without evidence, they couldn't do anything to him. Even. Gabriel glanced at Major Dura, a hint of doubt flashing in his eyes. Major Dura should have anticipated this outcome, but he hadn't arranged for men to protect Francis beforehand. In other words, Major Dura had actually given James the opportunity to silence him? Gabriel swallowed hard. Goosebumps rising on his skin. This world was fraught with danger. It wasn't just the battlefield where lives were at risk. Chapter 415 Blitzkrieg. Charles was completely unaware of the situation in the rear. At this time, he was leading his armored and mechanized divisions along a predetermined route. The tactic was the Blitzkrieg of World War II. Charles already possessed several conditions for Blitzkrieg. First, he had a powerful air force to control the air. Without air superiority, the armored and mechanized divisions would be bombed along the way, crippled before even reaching their destination, which was pointless. Second, the main offensive force, the armored divisions would break through at the front, the mechanized divisions would provide infantry and artillery support from the rear, and finally Foch's infantry would follow. The key was that the armored and mechanized divisions could break through quickly. If they were tied down by the enemy, the battle would become a stalemate. Finally, there was intelligence and infiltration. The German army in World War II used paratroopers and special forces. It is said that they spent several years recruiting a group of people who could speak English and Russian, who would infiltrate the enemy as British, American, and Soviet troops to seize important transportation hubs. Charles relied on the Lady in White and Belgian partisans. Otherwise, if the highway bridge in Valois had been destroyed by the Germans, no matter how much preparation Charles made, the tanks, armored vehicles, and cars wouldn't be able to cross, and the entire plan would have been annihilated. Fortunately, none of this happened. Charles advanced in an armored vehicle, wearing a helmet like the soldiers and sitting in the back of the vehicle. Even the communications officer had to take some effort to find Charles. Along the way, there were German prisoners everywhere. They had been disarmed, their belts removed, covered in mud, and walking dejectedly under the guns of the French. They looked at the vehicles passing by with a mixture of fear and envy in their eyes. Charles was looking at a map in the vehicle and ignored them. A sidecar sped up from the front, passing Charles and then turning around before catching up. The communications officer reported to Charles in the vehicle, "General, the partisans have successfully captured the Vatten Highway Bridge, and our vanguard has joined forces with the partisans." Charles breathed a sigh of relief, and his heart, which had been hanging in suspense, was finally at ease. Sitting opposite him, Tidjany chuckled softly. "Brigadier General, just how much preparation have you made?" Charles hadn't told Tidjany beforehand. The fewer people who knew, the better, and telling Tidjany wouldn't help anyway. "What you've seen is pretty much everything," Charles replied calmly. "Except for Brussels. You've made preparations in Brussels too." Tidjany looked at Charles incredulously. Charles pointed to the map and explained, "The German rear is very weak. After the Vatten Highway Bridge, the Germans have almost nothing that can stop us, as long as we're fast enough." Tidjany nodded. Armored and mechanized divisions, advancing at around 30 kilometers per hour, could reach Brussels, 100 kilometers away, in just over 3 hours, if not counting rest periods. Add to that the relentless bombing of the railway lines, and the Germans would have almost no troops to stop them in time. "Only Brussels," Charles said. "There's a German division there, a reserve division, not very strong, but they are inside the city." Tidjany nodded in understanding. "Tanks are unsuitable for urban warfare. The Germans could take cover in corners or on rooftops, throwing grenades or explosives at them. Furthermore, the French would have to clear or contest every house with the Germans, creating obstacles in their advance. Charles was thinking of the Battle of Stalingrad. Urban warfare remained a challenge until World War II. However, Brussels, as the capital of Belgium and a crucial transportation hub, was unavoidable. Otherwise, logistical support and even reinforcements could be cut off there. Charles calmly pulled another map from his briefcase, a detailed map of Brussels. Pointing to the stadium in the north of the city, he said, "The Germans have converted this into a military camp, and the armory is located in the underground warehouse of the adjacent textile factory." Armory. Tigeny instantly understood. "You're planning to blow up the armory." The German 82nd Reserve Division, commanded by Major General Heir, was stationed in Brussels. This division had been withdrawn from the front lines a month prior, arriving with only a little over 3,000 men. Within a week, it rapidly expanded to over 27,000, preparing for a month of training before being deployed back to the battlefield. Chief of Staff Colonel Avery was troubled by this. Looking at the troops training on the parade ground, he said worriedly, "If there's anything different about them compared to civilians, it's that they've just learned to fire a gun." Major General Khalil, sitting in a chair drinking coffee, coldly replied, "That's enough, Colonel. What else do we need?" Colonel Avery paused, then let out a bitter laugh. Major General Khalil's words, though extremely cold-blooded, were true. Trench warfare seemed to require no special skills from the soldiers, only the ability to endure hardship and fire a gun. Because what they did every day, day after day, was simply this: endure the harsh conditions of the trenches, live like primitive people, and then, when the enemy charged, pop out and pull the trigger, killing the enemy or being killed by the enemy. That was all. Major General Khalil rose, coffee in hand, and walked over to Alfred, glancing towards the firing range. "Any more training in Danvin would be a waste, Colonel, because no one can dodge artillery fire." Alfred was speechless, but then he remembered someone. "Charles's troops might be different. I heard he's training aggressively." "Perhaps," Khalil replied, "but that's irrelevant to us." Just then, the staff officer on the phone exclaimed, "Something's up, General. Charles's troops have broken through the Cambrai defenses. They're advancing rapidly along the road. They'll likely reach Brussels in 3 hours." A gasp rippled through the command post, and everyone, including Major General Khalil, paled. Just a moment ago, they thought Brussels was the rear, hoping to stay a few more days and enjoy themselves. But now it had become the front line. The enemy would be here in 3 hours. Unbelievable. Khalil asked doubtfully, "We're 100 kilometers from Cambrai. How could the enemy get here in 3 hours? Did they come by car?" "I'm sorry, General," the staff officer replied. "They did indeed come by car." Khalil was speechless. He took the telegram from the staff officer, glanced at it, and then looked up and shouted, "What are you all standing there for? Prepare for battle. This is not training. Open the ammunition depot and get the ammunition out immediately." "Yes, General." The communications soldier turned to relay the order. Unbeknownst to Khalil, a squad of German soldiers happened to be outside the ammunition depot, waiting for the communications soldier to deliver the order to open the depot and distribute ammunition. Chapter 416 Charles's Luck. Lagerdon, the French General Staff headquarters, was as quiet as ever. After getting up and entering his office that morning, Joffre pretended to be busy, trying hard not to think about the Bastille Day parade. As commander-in-chief, he should have been receiving the cheers of the French people at the parade, but instead, he was confined to his office facing piles of documents and intelligence. The government had indeed invited Joffre to attend, but he had refused. Joffre knew what would happen if he went. The cheers were reserved for Charles, and he, as commander-in-chief, would be a figurehead, receiving only boos and pitying glances. At the reception, someone might sarcastically ask, "Commander-in-chief, could you tell me which battles you've won?" Joffre would be awkwardly put in his place. He couldn't very well answer, "No, sir, I haven't won any battles. All the victories were won by Charles. I was just a hindrance." To avoid such embarrassment, Joffre gritted his teeth and replied to Clemenceau, who had extended the invitation, "I'm sorry, Your Excellency, I believe I should be at my post. You know, the Germans know today is our national day, and they might very well seize this opportunity to launch an attack while many officers are away. Let me, as Commander-in-Chief, be responsible for guarding the front lines. It's my duty." Clemenceau, of course, knew this was Joffre's excuse. The defenses were already stable and didn't require command. The junior officers at the front knew what to do. More importantly, Joffre's command was unimportant. Having him around or not made no difference, and might even be better. But the shrewd and experienced Clemenceau didn't expose him. He replied, "Greetings, Your Excellency. The front indeed needs someone to command. I will explain this to the government." Even though Joffre's wish was fulfilled, even though he pretended nothing had happened, Joffre still felt a pang of bitterness in his heart. This wasn't what Joffre wanted. What he truly wanted was to be admired by thousands at the military parade, to speak amidst the cheers of the crowd, to hear the entire French people shout wildly for him. But now, it was Charles who enjoyed all of this. Charles. Just as Joffre was gritting his teeth in hatred, Carnegie walked up to him and carefully handed him a telegram. "General, I think you might want to know this." Joffre took the telegram, glanced at it, and suddenly looked up in shock. Charles didn't participate in the military parade. "Yes," Carnegie replied. "He led the 1st Tank Brigade in the 105th Infantry Regiment in the attack on the Germans at Cambrai." Joffre's face darkened, feeling a sense of humiliation. Joffre had agreed to join Army Group East, and he was patiently waiting for the Italians to break through the Austro-Hungarian defenses when Charles unexpectedly joined Army Group North and launched an attack. What a breach of trust! And he, the commander-in-chief, was completely unaware of this. Not only had Charles not mentioned it, but Foch hadn't said a word either. They must have conspired, Joffre muttered to himself. Keynes was taken aback. Charles and Foch? They were on his side. How could he say they conspired? Besides, this telegram was sent by General Foch, Keynes explained. He said he only just learned about it. Joffre scoffed. Of course, that wasn't the case. Even a fool would know that a deep penetration required the manpower and logistical support of Army Group North, which required detailed planning. But Joffre couldn't do anything about Foch. Although Foch was the deputy commander-in-chief and, in principle, had to obey Joffre's command, Foch had laid the foundation for the French army's tactical theory, and his prestige within the army even surpassed Joffre's. Another similar general was Guerrieri, who rose to fame during the defense of Paris. Although he commanded a relatively minor reserve army group, he still enjoyed considerable autonomy. Joffre picked up the telegram again and examined it closely, then turned his gaze to the map. Keynes quickly stepped forward and pointed to the location on the telegram. "Here. Their march is very fast. It's only been a little over 2 hours since the battle began at 9 o'clock, and they've already advanced to the vicinity of Mons." Joffre looked up at Keynes. 50 kilometers in just over 2 hours. His tone was accusatory, his eyes reproachful. "You must have the wrong location. This is a basic mistake." No wonder Joffre thought this way. At this time, the concepts of armored and mechanized units didn't exist. In Joffre's mind, an army advancing at 5 kilometers per hour was the maximum, and that was if they were advancing at a rapid pace without enemy resistance. But now, Charles's advance was reaching over 20 kilometers per hour? This was impossible. "Yes, General," but Keynes insisted. Charles armed all his troops with vehicles, which made them very mobile. Meanwhile, the German rear was very vulnerable. There were no troops all the way to Brussels. Most of the police were Belgians, who had already instigated an uprising and taken control of the police stations before Charles' troops arrived. The German management model involved organizing a small police force to maintain order. This seemed fine in peacetime, but once the French breached the lines, the Belgians, including the police, would rush to revolt. Therefore, Charles' army not only encountered no resistance but also received considerable assistance along the way. For example, food supplies were largely unaffected, and people provided Charles with vehicles, gasoline, and even expressed a desire to join the French army. Note, during World War II, Germany learned from this lesson and changed its occupation model to have the Wehrmacht fight on the front lines while the SS followed up in the rear to maintain order and combat partisans. Joffre was stunned for a while before he could process this. He sighed softly, still unable to understand why, no matter the battle, Charles always seemed to advance smoothly, while others often suffered heavy casualties and couldn't make a single step forward. Staring at the map for a while, Joffre asked, "The Germans have troops stationed in Brussels, right?" "Of course," Carnes replied, "a reserve division, about 20,000 men." Joffre hummed in agreement and offered his assessment of the battle. "This is an overconfident and reckless advance. Once they're blocked by the enemy in Brussels, his troops will face encirclement." Then Joffre's eyes lit up. "Is Charles in the army?" "Yes," Carnes confirmed. "He's advancing with the 105th Infantry Regiment." A slight smile crept onto Joffre's lips. This was the best news he'd heard all day. However, just then, A staff officer rushed in with a telegram, excitedly reporting, "General, the German troops in Brussels have retreated." Retreated? Joffre was taken aback. Why did they retreat? It said the ammunition depot exploded, the staff officer replied. Joffre was stunned. Was it a coincidence? Luck? Or Charles's arrangement? Chapter 417 Ammunition Depot. This was certainly not Charles's luck. Charles never relied on luck to win. He learned from the lady in white that this was a hastily organized, temporary unit, most of whose members would be split into several teams and sent to the front lines after completing their training. This provided the basis for taking advantage of the chaos. Therefore, Charles ordered the lady in white to forge documents and uniforms. The documents were detailed, including home addresses and birth information, and all were genuine. However, these German soldiers had already died in the First Battle of Cambrai, and their unit designations were simply changed to those stationed in Brussels. This unit was led by a partisan platoon leader named Lukaku, who before becoming a partisan was a second lieutenant in the Belgian army, commanding a fortified gun at the Liège fortress. The fortified gun commanded by Lukaku was eventually destroyed by the German deployed Grande Bertha. That battle was etched deeply into Lukaku's mind. When he spoke of it with his comrades around the campfire, his eyes were filled with profound fear. The scariest thing isn't death, but waiting for it. We were stuck in the pitch-black fortress, our artillery range insufficient to hit the enemy, but the enemy could. We could only watch helplessly as they aimed at us, shot after shot, until finally they hit us. His platoon of 30-odd men were buried in the collapsed fortress. Their bodies weren't recovered for days, but Lukaku miraculously survived. He was the sole survivor of the fortress. Lukaku chuckled self-deprecatingly. The good thing is, from then on, I was fearless, because nothing was more terrifying than that experience. But this time, as he and 20 men, dressed in German uniforms, waited in the textile factory storeroom, he still felt a deep-seated fear. Lukaku's palms sweated with tension. He wasn't worried about his own life or death, but rather the heavy responsibility on his shoulders. If they couldn't successfully destroy the ammunition depot, the Germans would block Charles's advance through Brussels. What would happen? Brussels wouldn't be liberated, the German army wouldn't be encircled, and even Charles's troops might be counter-encircled here. The consequences would be unimaginable. Just then, the bell hanging on the wall rang, a signal from intelligence personnel telling them it was time to move out. Lukaku didn't hesitate, leading his men out of the storeroom in single file. They glanced warily to both sides, then casually carried their rifles and marched in formation towards the ammunition depot. Blocking Lukaku's path was a German lieutenant. He checked Lukaku's identification, asked a few questions, found nothing suspicious, and waved them in. Lukaku was about to leave when the lieutenant stopped him. "You're just going to walk in like this?" The lieutenant gestured towards the rifles on their shoulders. Lukaku immediately realized he had to disarm. He glanced around, quickly analyzing the current situation in his mind. They were still 50 meters from the ammunition depot, guarded by 30-odd German soldiers with machine guns, and the depot was underground. If they attacked now, they would likely be wiped out before even reaching the depot entrance. Without much thought, Lukaku replied, "Yes, sir," and gestured for his men to do the same as he unbuckled his rifle. The men exchanged bewildered glances, but one by one, they put their rifles away on the rack. The German lieutenant didn't suspect anything. He simply watched Lukaku and his men's retreating figures and muttered, "These recruits, they know nothing." The partisans panicked. No guns, what were they going to do? But Lukaku calmly led them forward. Reaching the warehouse entrance, he casually handed them the supply slip and said to the warehouse keeper, "We've been ordered to collect ammunition. Colonel Leo wants to conduct grenade training first. You know, we heard the French are sending tank units." The warehouse keeper grunted, took the supply slip, and glanced at it. "You mean grenades first?" "Yes," Lukaku replied. "Our trucks will be here soon." The partisans seemed to understand Lukaku's meaning. Grenades didn't require guns, all it took was pulling the pin. So, they mentally prepared themselves. As boxes of grenades were unloaded from the warehouse, the guerrillas pretended to inspect them, opening the ammunition boxes and then casually unscrewing the safety caps on each one. "Hey, what are you doing?" the warehouse manager exclaimed. "This isn't your training ground." Lukaku didn't say much, lit the grenades, and threw them at the German guards. The warehouse manager and the porters could only watch helplessly. These people working in the ammunition depot were unarmed, and many were temporary logistics personnel without professional military training. They were all stunned, watching the battle erupt before their eyes. Boom! 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 The German guards screamed in terror as they were blown apart, but the survivors quickly organized a counterattack. A lieutenant blew his whistle in the smoke, and a squad of guards rushed out to reinforce them. "What do we do?" a subordinate shouted to Lukaku after throwing a grenade. Without guns, they remained extremely passive. Storming the ammunition depot was virtually impossible, blocked by a group of strong, burly porters, all Germans. "Cover me," Lukaku yelled. His teammates were confused. How could they provide cover without guns? Then, when they saw Lukaku tie several grenades together with a rope, they understood his intention. The men threw grenades one after another, almost without stopping. One man even jumped out with a bundle of grenades and rushed towards the enemy's hiding place, forcefully repelling their attack. Without hesitation, Lukaku, holding grenades, leaned against the warehouse door, lit one, and threw it inside. After the explosion, he immediately rushed in. Panic erupted inside the warehouse, and people cried and frantically fled. Meanwhile, Major General Khalil was discussing defense strategies with his staff, referring to a map of Brussels. Avery suggested building the defensive line along the streets, especially at transportation hubs. "We can pile up sandbags there and build several lines of defense in half an hour," but Major General Khalil shook his head. "No, Colonel. The enemy is coming with tanks. This kind of defense line built with sandbags is no match for tanks." "But what else can we do?" Avery asked. "Buildings," Major General Khalil said, pointing to the houses on both sides of the street. "Every building is part of our defense line." Avery's eyes showed some fear. "But General, this will bring the fighting to civilians." Major General Khalil dismissed this. "That's not something we need to consider." At this moment, several grenade explosions suddenly rang out. The two men were startled and looked in the direction of the sound. "Training," Major General Khalil said. Avery heard gunfire and whistles, and his face instantly turned pale. "No, General, it's from the ammunition depot." Chapter 418 Liberating Brussels. Major General Khalil was about to order reinforcements when a deafening explosion interrupted his order. The ground shook violently as if in an earthquake, shattered glass rained down, and several fragments cut a bloody gash on Major General Khalil's face. Avery, leaning against the windowsill, also had his hand cut by shards of glass, bleeding profusely, but neither of them paid any attention. These were insignificant. "It's the ammunition depot," Avery exclaimed, looking at Major General Khalil in horror. "It might have been blown up," Major General Khalil thought. "It should be removed. It's obvious." Everyone in the command post was in shock. They stopped what they were doing and looked in the direction of the explosion, where a huge plume of smoke was rising, and faint cries and wails could be heard. Just then, the communications soldier rushed in to report, "General, the guerrillas attacked the ammunition depot." Major General Khalid's forward vein throbbed. He ignored the communications soldier and gritted his teeth, asking Avery, "How much ammunition do we have left?" "Only training ammunition, General," Avery replied. "An average of 30 rounds per person, and perhaps only 3,000 grenades." This was the number before training. It was now nearing noon, and half a day's training might have used up half of it. "What about other ammunition reserves?" Major General Khalid asked again. Avery shook his head. Brussels was the rear area, at least it had been before. No one would store ammunition here. This only ammunition depot was for training. Major General Khalid didn't hesitate, turning to reprimand the bewildered staff officers in the room. "What are you all standing around for? Immediately contact any possible units, anyone, anywhere, as long as they have ammunition." "Yes, sir." The staff officers immediately sprang into action. Some contacted their superiors to report the situation, some contacted nearby troops, and some contacted trains. 3 hours, if they were fast, transporting ammunition by train seemed feasible. But Avery shook his head slightly. "It won't work, General. Air superiority is in the French hands. Since Charles went to such lengths to destroy the ammunition depot, he wouldn't have left such a large opening for us to replenish our ammunition." Major General Khalil was stunned, staring blankly at Avery, speechless. Avery was only half right. At this time, Charles was indeed using bombers to attack Brussels supply lines, especially the railways. But at this time, there weren't enough bombers. They had to suppress German howitzers, cooperate with the partisans, bomb important German targets, and also take on the task of disrupting transportation lines and blocking Brussels. On the other hand, Charles considered that using bombers to attack transportation lines was not ideal, especially roads. A batch of bombs would only create a small crater in the road surface, which could be filled with soil and passable again. Therefore, this task was mostly carried out by the partisans. They attacked everywhere, artificially creating collapses on the railways and roads leading to Brussels. Some had even begun preparations a month in advance, hollowing out the roadbeds and supporting them with logs, so that the logs could be simply sawed off when needed to cut off traffic. Thus, the once well-connected Brussels was reduced to only two routes, the road and rail from Mons to Brussels, and from Brussels to Antwerp, reserved for Charles's troops to maneuver. But even these routes were fraught with danger. The high ground on either side had been occupied by partisans, and the roads were rigged with explosives, ready to destroy any German ammunition trucks that passed by. After making contact, Major General Calais finally understood his predicament. Brussels was practically surrounded. Forget ammunition, even food was difficult to bring in, and reinforcements were out of the question. They were either far away in Germany or on the front lines 100 kilometers away, and were likely on the verge of collapse. A telegram arrived with the order from Lieutenant General DM, the Army Group Commander: no matter the difficulties, hold Brussels. Do not retreat an inch. Major General Calais glanced at the telegram, crumpled it up, and threw it on the ground. Reply: Hallel said calmly and firmly. Tell the Lieutenant General that we cannot complete the mission. Staying here will only lead to surrender. Therefore, I refuse to carry out the order. Hallel then cast a questioning glance at Every. Every nodded slightly in agreement. With a unit out of ammunition, trapped in the Belgian capital, surrounded by guerrillas eager to kill the Germans, and with Charles's troops arriving in a few hours, what could they possibly defend? Staying meant either being wiped out or taken prisoner. There was no third possibility. Brussels wasn't captured by Charles, it had been liberated before his troops arrived. Initially, people didn't react much, even seeing the Germans retreating from the city like stray dogs. They assumed it was a normal German troop movement. Knowing the situation, the partisans, carrying their guns, took to the streets shouting, "Come out, gentlemen, we are free. The days of the Germans occupying us are over." People couldn't believe it was true. They asked doubtfully, "Have we really won? But why haven't we seen our troops?" It was indeed hard to believe that the partisans, with only a few men and a few broken guns, had driven the Germans out of Belgium. The partisans proudly replied, "It's Charles. Charles's troops are advancing towards Brussels. The Germans know they can't defeat Charles's troops. They can only choose to flee. They won't come back, as long as we help Charles achieve victory." Only then did people gradually believe it. They cheered like it was a festival. The whole city was in an uproar. People rushed into the streets to celebrate, and some even spontaneously organized to welcome Charles's troops. More than an hour later, Charles's troops arrived in Brussels. The French troops received a hero's welcome. The Belgians showered the troops with flowers and food, and some Belgian women even excitedly hugged and kissed the French soldiers. Charles and Téligny had made preparations before entering the city. They changed into uniforms befitting a major and lieutenant, and hid anything that could reveal their identities, such as the radio. This was to guard against assassinations by German agents within the city. Charles didn't want to die for cheers and gratitude. In his eyes, these were insignificant, but his life was his, and he only had one. But Charles was eventually recognized. A young girl holding flowers frantically chased after the armored vehicle, lifting her skirt, and climbed onto it without hesitation. Once she was steady, she breathlessly presented the flowers to Charles. "Thank you, sir, thank you so much." Her voice trailed off, her smile froze, and then her beautiful blue eyes suddenly lit up with excitement as she exclaimed, "Charles, God, you're Charles." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 419 Unprepared. Before Charles could stop her, the girl waved and cheered to the surrounding crowd. "He's here. Charles is with me. Charles is here." People turned to look at Charles. Many of them had seen him there during the Antwerp refugee crisis and quickly recognized him. It really is him. Charles is over there. He's grown up. He looks much more mature. My God, he's fighting alongside the troops. A respectable hero, Charles had no choice but to get up and wave to the crowd. This sparked another round of cheers, and people rushed towards the armored vehicle like madmen, vying to offer flowers and shake Charles's hand. "You saved us, General, once again. I deeply regret what happened in Antwerp. It wasn't our intention. Thank you for saving Belgium again." Charles could only smile and respond to each one. But in truth, he felt a chill run down his spine. If even one German sniper was lurking nearby or in a building, his life as a general would be over. Fortunately, the guerrillas stepped forward and pushed the people aside, shouting, "This is war. Charles is in a hurry to pursue the enemy. Do you want to help them escape?" The people unconsciously made way for the army, but the cheers continued to grow louder. The convoy finally passed through Brussels safely, and Charles breathed a sigh of relief. Tidjane, looking at the several lipstick marks on Charles's face, smiled and teased, "Our general has had a smooth journey on the battlefield, but he almost drowned in a woman's lipstick." The nearby soldiers burst into laughter. Charles frantically wiped the lipstick marks from his face, but it seemed to multiply and become sticky. This only made Tidjane and the soldiers laugh more. They hadn't expected that their general, so decisive on the battlefield, was still like a child in his personal life. After laughing for a while, Tidjane took a map from his pocket, got up, and sat down next to Charles, spreading it out. "Now, after Mechelen, we'll reach Antwerp, about 35 kilometers away," Charles countered. "You want to ask how we should take it?" "Of course," Tidjane nodded. "It's the most crucial link. Only by taking it could the German encirclement be closed." "Taking it won't be easy," Tidjane said, pointing to the map. "Although the Germans stationed there are only a single regiment of recruits, they have time to send reinforcements. Besides, I heard they've fortified their defenses and repaired several fortresses." Charles nodded. That was a side effect of the Dardanelles campaign. Charles had previously tried to convince the Germans that the British would land in the north and attack Belgium from the rear. "I'd like to know what preparations you've made for this," Tidjane asked with interest. "I haven't made any," Charles replied. "Impossible," Tidjane laughed. But seeing Charles's serious expression, his smile gradually faded, replaced by worry. "Really no preparation? This could ruin everything," Charles calmly replied. "You're prepared, and our army is prepared too." "What do you mean?" Tidjane looked at Charles, puzzled. Charles looked around. Tidjane seemed to understand. "You mean, armored and mechanized units?" "Yes." Charles's gaze shifted to the location of Antwerp on the map. "But Antwerp has fortifications, and 200mm and 150mm artillery." Tidjane was somewhat anxious. "They can undoubtedly destroy our tanks and armored vehicles effortlessly." Tidjane had also made every effort to research relevant information before this battle. "I've been to Antwerp. I know what those fortresses are all about, General," Charles said as if it were a trivial matter. "When they were built, nobody even knew what a tank was." Tidjane gave a no. "You mean they were hard-to-hit targets?" Charles nodded. Like the German 105mm guns, the inner and outer fortifications of Antwerp seemed formidable, but while their design was aimed at enemy infantry attacks, armored and mechanized units that could withstand shrapnel were not considered. Charles concluded, "We just need to ignore those fortresses. If we treat them as if they don't exist, we should be able to win." "Should be?" Tidjane looked at Charles incredulously. "You're not sure? If not, it could mean total annihilation." Charles shrugged. "This is war, General. Nobody can be sure until the very end. Ben Nevis, a dormant volcano and the highest peak in Britain, is perpetually snow-capped, attracting numerous mountaineering enthusiasts. Albert I was a member of the mountaineering team, and they were currently enjoying lunch around a campfire, preparing to rest and regain their strength before continuing their journey. Albert I had organized this climb while suppressing his resentment, intending to use it as a way to clear his head. For the past few months, he had been working tirelessly to facilitate a British landing in the north, sparing no expense, even bribing British members of Parliament with huge sums of money. However, just when everything seemed to be settling down, and everyone believed the British would land in the north, the Dardanelles campaign began. To Albert I's further dismay, he had only recently learned the truth from General Winter. "You think Charles really intended to land from the north?" General Winter said on the phone. "No, Your Majesty. Charles never intended to land there, never changed his mind. We just messed up." "Impossible," Albert I replied. "He told me himself that he thought a landing from the north was more suitable." "Your Majesty," General Winter interrupted Albert I, "that was just to mislead the Germans. It would make them think the Dardanelles offensive was a feint, buying us more time. Albert I was stunned. He realized he had been used by Charles, like a fool. Why? He had considered Charles a friend, a confidant, the hope of Belgium. If anyone could save Belgium, it would be Charles. Yet, he had deceived himself, deceived everyone. Albert had even told the nation that victory was imminent, that Charles would liberate them with his troops. Albert slammed his hiking stick into the rocky ground, as if stabbing the enemy with a sword. Your Majesty, the communications officer standing guard at the radio looked at Albert I with astonishment. They say Charles's troops have advanced into Belgium and liberated Brussels. What? Albert I jumped up as if pricked by a needle. Say it again. Is it true? Chapter 420 The Fuel Dilemma. Mechelen is a medium-sized town in northern Belgium with a population of over 70,000. It is 22 kilometers from Brussels and 13 kilometers from Antwerp. Mr. Mignolet runs a gas station at the southwest corner of the town, and recently he has been reluctantly considering closing his business. After the Germans occupied Belgium, they would frequently drive cars and motorcycles to his gas station, fill up their tanks, and then refuse to pay. At least they haven't caused us any trouble, his wife said with relief. I thought they were going to rob us of everything. You think this is a good thing? Mr. Mignolet replied. They just don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. They're using our supply chain to provide them with gasoline in the long term. Mr. Mignolet, who was concerned about the international situation, knew that Germany was under a British naval blockade, and Britain intended to starve Germany through trade. Belgian merchants, on the other hand, were outside the blockade, and the Germans cleverly exploited this to obtain their valuable war resources. Unbelievable, Mr. Minael complained under his breath. We're actually funding the Germans. You could even say we're helping them occupy and control Belgium, but what can we do? His wife replied, her face filled with terror. What can we do after we close the business? Starve? She paused, then added, besides, do you think we have the right to close the business? Mr. Minael was taken aback. He realized his wife was right. The only reason they were at peace now was because they were bringing benefits to the Germans. If they really wanted to close it, the Germans would come knocking. But could they continue like this? Just as Mr. Minael was caught in a dilemma, a convoy of tanks rumbled down the road, followed by a long line of cars. They slowly slowed down in front of the gas station and finally pulled over. Mr. Minael looked at the massive convoy with terror in his eyes. See, Dana, it's time to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. His wife and all the employees in the shop stared blankly at the vehicles. If they filled all the tanks up for free, the gas station would go bankrupt. Just then, the tank compartment opened, and a captain with a mustache, wearing a helmet, emerged. He looked exhausted, and his face was smeared with oil. The helmet and uniform were unlike anything Mr. Mignolet had ever seen before. These must be the Germans' new uniforms, Mr. Mignolet thought. The mustachioed captain called out in French, Hey, sir, any gasoline? Give us some. Mr. Mignolet hesitated for a moment, then looked at the long convoy behind him and replied, Sorry, sir, we don't have that much gasoline. Give us as much as you have, the mustachioed captain urged. We're in a hurry. Yes, sir, Mr. Mignolet replied, thinking that his words were enough. Then he gave his wife and employees a wink and whispered, Just give them some gas and send them on their way. His wife and employees understood and immediately got to work. Several men pushed the oil drums to the front of the tank, stood them upright, opened the caps, and connected them to the pump. Mr. Mignolet personally went to greet them, afraid that his employees might let slip the truth. The mustachioed captain jumped off the tank, his gaze sweeping across the town ahead. He casually asked, Any Germans here? What? Mr. Mignolet was taken aback, then his eyes lit up. They were speaking French. French. You're French. Mr. Mignolet looked at the tank crew with a skeptical expression. The workers also stopped what they were doing, staring in surprise at the strange group of soldiers before them. What? Do we look German? The mustachioed captain had a faint smile on his face. The surrounding soldiers chuckled. But, Mr. Mignolet's scalp tingled. You, how did you get here? I mean, where are the Germans? The mustachioed captain calmly retorted, Isn't that the question I'm asking you? The soldiers laughed even harder. Then someone gave the answer, We are Charles's troops, sir. Have you heard of Charles? Of course, of course. Mr. Minael was so excited that he was incoherent. Charles? Who hasn't heard of Charles? You are actually his troops, but I I didn't even hear a gunshot." Mr. Minael looked around, wondering if he had missed something. "Don't doubt it," the mustachioed captain said casually. "We've moved too fast, the main German force is far behind. Just tell me, are there any Germans in town? If so, where are they?" "Yes, sir," Mr. Minulet nodded repeatedly. "There are 2 German squads stationed at the government building and the police station. They're using this to control the whole town." The mustachioed captain spread out a map on the tank. "The government building and the police station," Mr. Minulet immediately pointed out the locations on the map, "here, and here. Not many, probably less than 100 men in total." A hint of disappointment flashed across the mustachioed captain's face. He turned and called out to the rear, "Luca, have Jerome take his troops and take them out." "Yes, Captain." Then 2 tanks, leading a convoy of armored vehicles, crossed the convoy and drove along the road towards the town. The armored vehicles carried squads of heavily armed French soldiers, ready for battle. Mr. Minael then realized they were French troops, there to liberate Belgium. He hurriedly turned to his wife and shouted, "Dana, get all the gasoline out, all of it." The mustachioed captain joked, "You just said you didn't have much gasoline left." "That was for the Germans, sir," Mr. Minael replied, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Charles's troops rested in Mechelen, which could also be considered pre-battle preparation. The biggest problem for armored and mechanized divisions was the need for large amounts of fuel, especially for tanks, which consumed an astonishing 200 liters per 100 kilometers. By the time the army reached Mechelen, the fuel they carried was almost exhausted, and fuel supplies from the rear couldn't be delivered immediately because the roads and railways had been cut off by the main German forces. Furthermore, although the Charles A1 tanks had undergone several improvements and were used for road warfare, they still required maintenance every 100 kilometers or so, otherwise, only a few would be operational by the time they reached Antwerp. However, the fuel shortage was soon resolved. Hearing that Charles's troops needed gasoline, the Belgians in Mechelen spontaneously organized to transport it from nearby areas, even emptying the gas tanks of their own vehicles. 13 kilometers to go, Charles thought, glancing at the darkening sky, a new idea forming in his mind. The Germans' new tanks lacked night fighting capabilities, they would assume the French would attack at dawn. Should he give them a surprise now? Chapter 421 knows too much? Under the starlit night sky, the German troops in Antwerp were still busy. Fearing guerrilla infiltration, they dared not even hire Belgians to build fortifications. They mobilized all the manpower they deemed trustworthy, including logistics personnel, communications soldiers, and even officers. At the center of Antwerp lay layers of fortifications and trenches. Inside the city, the manor house that once belonged to Albert I was brightly lit, as staff officers bustled about, trying to obtain more information via telephone and telegram. Telegrams were passed to Major General von Marcus, the commander of the German forces, but his brow furrowed deeper and deeper. Finally, he couldn't contain himself any longer and stood up abruptly, slamming the telegram on the table in anger, demanding sharply, "I just want to know the location of the French army. Can anyone tell me where their main force is? I need a location, a precise location." No one answered, because no one knew. The staff officers nervously avoided Marcus's gaze, their heads bowed like children who had done something wrong. All German intelligence units were at the front, even within France, but not in Belgium. Especially around Brussels, which they had previously considered a very safe rear area. Therefore, once the telephone lines to Brussels were cut, it became a veritable unknown zone, and no one knew what was happening. A staff officer stepped forward with a document and cautiously reported, "General, we believe the French will not attack tonight, at the earliest tomorrow morning." "How can you be so sure?" Marcus retorted. The staff officer handed over a document and a prepared telegram, saying, "We have contacted Major General Nicholas, commander of the 1st Tank Division." Marcus took the document and glanced at it. It contained Nicholas's analysis of the limitations of tank warfare. His conclusion was, tanks are unsuitable for night fighting. At night, they can't see anything, making them practically blind. Major General Marcus grunted in agreement, his expression softening slightly. The staff group had finally played a role. The staff officer continued reporting, "Meanwhile, we've also received advice from Captain Irwin, who has considerable experience in tank defense. He believes that wide trenches can effectively prevent tanks from passing." The staff officer handed over a diagram illustrating how tanks would get stuck in wide trenches. Major General Marcus understood at a glance and immediately ordered, "Then what are we waiting for? Order the troops to dig wider trenches immediately," the staff officer replied hesitantly. "But General, we have many trenches but a severe shortage of manpower. Even by dawn, we won't be able to complete half." Marcus paced back and forth behind his desk, hands behind his back, and asked, "When will the 192nd Infantry Regiment arrive?" "Probably another 2 hours. The 87th Reserve Division will arrive before dawn," the staff officer replied. It goes without saying that neither of these reinforcements could change the difficulties in constructing the fortifications. Suddenly, Marcus paused, turned back to the map, and stared at the Antwerp defensive map. After a moment, he said slowly, "Perhaps we don't need to widen all the trenches." The staff officer looked at Marcus with confusion. "But only widened trenches could stop tanks. We only need to modify one trench." Marcus pointed to the front of the defensive line. "Widen the first trench by 4 meters to ensure that enemy tanks cannot pass," the staff officer said. "Oh," understanding Major General Marcus's meaning. If the first trench could definitely stop enemy tanks, there was no need to widen the other trenches. In addition, the artillery inside the fortress could mark these trenches, and once enemy tanks were blocked in front of the trenches, they would immediately suffer devastating damage. "I'll give the order immediately," the staff officer replied. "No." Marcus took his military cap from the wall, put it on, grabbed a riding crop from the table, and ordered as he walked towards the door, "I will personally oversee the construction of this trench. Immediately move all available manpower here." He seemed quite pleased with his brilliant idea, even believing it to be the key to stopping the French attack tomorrow, even if it was Charles's troops attacking. Antwerp front. The first line of defense was about 500 meters in front of the fortified perimeter. The 2 layers of fortified perimeter in Antwerp contain 3 types of artillery: long range, medium range, and short range. The short-range artillery consisted of 77mm field guns, 4 in each fortress. The theoretical range of the 77mm field gun was 5 kilometers, but in practice, it was mostly used for direct fire at around 500 meters. Note, this was a result of suppression by the French 75mm guns. The 75mm guns were accurate, had a higher rate of fire, and a long range. If the German 77mm guns didn't get close enough to kill the enemy in one shot, they would be crushed by the 75mm guns. The first line of defense was set up to coordinate with the 77mm field guns within the fortresses. Marcus was satisfied with the distance. He believed that once enemy tanks were blocked at this trench, they would become targets for the 77mm guns inside the fortress. "This is it," Major General Marcus shouted confidently to the men following behind. "Wide this defensive line to 4 meters, 2 meters deep, and it must be completed before dawn." "Yes, General." One by one, the soldiers jumped into the trench, wielding their entrenching tools. But soon someone shouted, "General, can we light torches?" "Good idea. The enemy isn't here anyway. Lighting torches will be more efficient." Major General Marcus glanced into the darkness towards Brussels to the south and nodded. "No problem, as long as you finish before dawn. Everyone will get an extra pack of cigarettes tomorrow." The soldiers cheered. Soon, torches were lit, and the Germans even used long poles to prop them up high so the light could reach a wider area. The German soldiers dug diligently under the torchlight, some carrying soil, some measuring, some directing, all busy and enthusiastic. At this moment, Charles and Tycoon were lying in the grass 2 miles away, watching the Germans' bizarre maneuver. "What are they doing?" Tycoon asked, putting away his binoculars, his voice full of doubt. "They've clearly laid out their defensive lines right in front of us." The French, who previously had no way of knowing the location of the enemy trenches, now knew it perfectly well. Charles smiled and replied, "That's because they know too much." "Know too much?" Tycoon was even more baffled. What did that have to do with exposing the trenches? Charles hummed in agreement. "They know tanks aren't suitable for night fighting." Tycoon paused for a moment, then suddenly understood. Because they knew tanks weren't suitable for night fighting, they assumed the French wouldn't attack at night, so they confidently lit torches to build fortifications. Tycoon laughed. They must be thinking that once they hear the enemy tank engines, they can extinguish the torches in time. Chapter 422 Attacking by Surprise. Charles raised his hand, paused for a moment in midair, then waved it forward. Squads of French soldiers, hidden in the darkness, crouched low and rifles in hand, advanced towards the enemy lines. It was a perfect opportunity. The enemy lines and fortifications were clearly visible under the torchlight. The sound of shovels being used to construct fortifications masked the advance of the French infantry, and the torchlight further obscured the figures moving in the darkness from the German sentries. The intelligence had been accurate. Those stationed in Antwerp were indeed inexperienced recruits. They knew nothing of war, its brutality, and that there was no second chance to make a mistake. The French used this opportunity to prepare thoroughly. Barbed wire was cut in sections and secured with steel cables, the other end attached to armored vehicles for hauling. Infantrymen first crossed a barbed wire, infiltrating about 50 meters into the lines. Snipers found their positions, and machine gunners occupied the high ground. Artillery observers measured the coordinates and verified them repeatedly, providing extremely accurate firing data. 3 kilometers away, truck-mounted artillery positions were set up according to specifications, with the guns aimed at the enemy. More than half an hour later, Tycoon believed there was nothing left to prepare except to assign numbers to the German soldiers. Only then did Charles order the armored division, which had been lying in ambush 2 kilometers away, to advance. Tanks entered the attack position one after another, with the tank commanders sticking their heads out of their vehicles to direct the tanks' advance, followed by armored vehicles, and finally the Saint-Simon tanks. This was the most awkward moment for the Saint-Simon tanks. Although the Charles A1 tank also suffered from poor external detection capabilities, it was operated by 2 people. The commander, who was also the gunner, could reach the driver with his legs outstretched. A kick to the left shoulder turned left, a kick to the right shoulder turned right, and a kick to the back turned forward, making its movement steady and effortless. The image above shows the internal structure of a Renault tank. Its simple structure and small crew make it easy to coordinate. A larger crew requires extensive training to achieve combat effectiveness. Armored vehicles, of course, have no problem. Their external sensing capabilities are the strongest, and as long as they are slow, they are generally safe. Even though the Saint Sam tank has been modified to remove the machine gun, it still has 5 crew members, who are somewhat flustered in the dark. Fortunately, they are artillery pieces, and their task is to stay in the rear, find suitable artillery positions, and prepare for battle, which prevented any major chaos. At that time, Major General Marcus and his staff were discussing how to strengthen the fortified defenses under the torchlight, holding a deployment map. "We don't need to worry about the position under fire," Major General Marcus said. "With a double firepower of trenches and bunkers, I believe no unit can break through. The problem is the bunkers themselves." Major General Marcus pointed to the locations of several bunkers. "These bunkers have been bombed into ruins by us. We've just replaced them with pillboxes, which are far inferior to the original bunkers in terms of firepower and defense. The French will definitely use these weaknesses as a breakthrough point." "I agree, General," the staff officer replied, "but I don't think we should build trenches. Trenches can't stop enemy shells. We need artillery that can suppress enemy artillery. Only they can guarantee the safety of these bunkers." The staff officer always had great confidence in the German 105mm guns. But Major General Marcus disagreed. "Charles has bombers, rough. Bombers will render our 105mm guns ineffective. We can't place our hopes on them, so the only option is trenches. Dig more trenches around the bunkers. Only trenches can protect against enemy artillery and airstrikes. Although they may seem crude, they are effective." However, Major General Marcus and his staff hadn't anticipated that the battle wouldn't progress as they had imagined. The most important aspect of blitzkrieg wasn't tactical infiltration, but its strategic significance. Simply put, it was about catching the enemy off guard. However, these seemingly commonplace words were difficult to execute on the battlefield. Charles launched this night raid amidst much opposition. "General, our troops have been marching and fighting all day. They're exhausted and unable to continue. General, tanks aren't suitable for night combat. Please reconsider. General, we're running low on fuel. If the attack fails, we might not even be able to retreat, and we'll have to destroy the tanks or leave them for the enemy." Colonel Estini was the most vehement opponent, believing Charles was acting rashly and blinded by victory. He excitedly rushed into Charles's temporary office in Mechelen. "General, the tanks will have plenty of fuel and air support after dawn. This battle can be fought very comfortably. Why should we use our weaknesses to attack the enemy's strengths? Victory is just one step away, General. We can't afford to lose our composure." Even Tycoon was skeptical of Charles's idea of night fighting, as it seemed to overturn all his previous conclusions. He, who thought he had mastered Charles's theory, was once again confused. Only one senior officer stood by Charles, Brownie, commander of the 1st Armored Division. However, he was a blind believer. Whatever Charles made, he believed must be correct. Faced with all the doubts, Charles only replied, "We have made ample preparations." Does that mean the enemy has also made ample preparations? Everyone fell silent instantly. Night fighting would certainly make the armored forces feel restricted and uncomfortable, but at least they were prepared both physically and psychologically, while the enemy was completely unprepared. The enemy was still planning their defenses for tomorrow, how many reinforcements they would send, how to deploy their firepower, and how to deal with the bombers when suddenly the enemy appeared before them. Everything was overturned, and it seemed all they could do was surrender. This was the situation Major General Marcus was facing. Just as he and his staff were at odds over the defensive direction, the faint rumble of engines could be heard in the darkness. At first, Major General Marcus thought it was his own vehicles, transporting timber to reinforce the fortifications. But the sound grew louder and more numerous. Major General Marcus suddenly awoke with a start. He looked up at his staff in shock, who also realized something and looked helplessly into the darkness. If the enemy attacked at this moment, it would be his mistake. He had judged that the enemy wouldn't fight at night. Major General Marcus didn't think much of it. He jumped up and shouted into the trench, "Stop the torches!" Immediately, bang, a gunshot rang out, and the shouting stopped abruptly. A bullet had accurately struck Major General Marcus in the head. His head lolled to the side, and he slumped to the ground like a sack of air drained from its shell. Chapter 423 Molotov Cocktail. The battle was one-sided from the start. The German soldiers carried entrenching tools instead of weapons, their rifles stacked up, muzzles facing upwards, beneath their torches. When the gunfire erupted, the German soldiers immediately dropped their entrenching tools and ran towards their guns, but bullets whistled through the air, felling them to pools of blood. The Germans couldn't even extinguish their torches, as grenades were already being hurled into the trenches. Simultaneously, the French 75mm mortars opened fire, shells landing precisely in the trenches, instantly creating trails of smoke. Nearby torches were blown away by the intense artillery fire, leaving only a few burning brightly in the night wind, illuminating the panicked, fleeing Germans. The French gave them no chance to escape. Soon the artillery fire extended, tossing groups of German soldiers violently into the air before slamming them back down. Then the tanks rattled out of the darkness, each followed by a squad of French soldiers who advanced, firing as they went, killing the surviving Germans one by one. Compared to the daytime fighting, the night battle was far more brutal, because Charles had given the order to take no prisoners. Tigny was somewhat surprised by this, and he hesitated, saying, "I thought you wouldn't do that." In Tigny's eyes, Charles had always been a positive and benevolent figure, even somewhat naive. The phrase "no prisoners" seemed out of place for Charles. But Charles's tone was surprisingly resolute. "We are an infiltration force, General. More importantly, the situation is unclear at night. If we get caught up in the chaos, our mechanized units could suffer heavy losses. This determines our survival. We have no choice but to do this." Tigny was silent for a moment. He understood Charles's meaning. Visibility was poor at night. The soldiers could only see a silhouette, unable to discern whether the other was firing or surrendering. Hesitation would be fatal if the enemy were to infiltrate the French ranks. "I agree," Tigny replied with difficulty. Compared to the Germans' use of poison gas on the battlefield, what did it matter if no prisoners were taken? Tigny convinced himself with this reasoning. The tank tracks rolled over the German corpses, the air thick with the stench of blood and gunpowder. In the flickering red light of the torches, tattered cloths hanging from the tracks were faintly visible, seemingly still dripping blood, and clumps of something else fell down, indistinguishable as minced flesh or dirt. Because the Germans hadn't had time to widen the trenches, the Charles A1 easily crossed them and continued its advance. The torches were extinguished one by the French soldiers. Now, they would undoubtedly illuminate the tanks, making them targets for enemy artillery. The world plunged into darkness again, with only streaks of light from artillery fire ahead, like lightning before a storm. The German fortresses remained silent. They couldn't fire. They had vaguely seen French tanks under their torches, but retreating German troops were running in dense, orderly columns ahead of them, the tanks practically crushing them. Firing now, even if they hit their targets, would result in friendly fire. After only a moment's hesitation, the few remaining torches were extinguished, leaving the fortress gunners staring blankly into the endless darkness beyond their observation slits. After Major General Marcus fell on the front lines, Staff Officer Rolfe immediately took command of the defensive line. He knew from the moment the battle began that the first line of defense couldn't be held, so he decisively abandoned it and led his men to the second line. This line was the last barrier of the outer fortress. 100 meters behind it lay the fortress's defensive perimeter. If it fell, the outer fortress would become completely useless. "Hold on," Rolfe shouted amidst the gunfire. "The enemy tanks can't see us, they don't know where to fire, we can hold them off." Rolfe believed that the enemy had pushed their tanks onto the battlefield at night not only to shield their charging soldiers from bullets, but also to try and scare their opponents into a rout. "Don't fall for it," Rolfe told himself. "They have no night fighting capability, they're just paper tigers." However, a faint flash of light arced through the darkness into the trench, followed by a sharp crack of shattering glass, and then a burst of flames erupted. 2 German soldiers were ignited, flailing their arms and screaming as they rolled and jumped. Surrounding soldiers rushed to extinguish the flames, but were unfortunately caught in the crossfire. Another soldier was tightly embraced by the firemen, also engulfed in flames, screaming and unable to break free. Rolfe exclaimed, "What is that?" But this was only the beginning. Before the Germans could react, more streaks of fire rolled in, and the trench instantly burst into flames. The German soldiers screamed in agony as the trenches burned, a fissure from hell, filled with death, pain, and despair. Then, the tanks roared to life, their machine guns and cannons firing precisely at the German trench walls and sandbags, killing the German soldiers lying in wait in droves. Rolfe realized then that he had been too simplistic. Charles had a way to give the tanks night fighting capabilities. Even if those capabilities were limited, they were sufficient to deal with a purely trench defense system. This was Charles's secret weapon in persuading Colonel Estini. Colonel Estini, who had a thorough understanding of the Charles A1, continued to persuade Charles in the command post, "General, I still hope you will carefully consider night combat. The Charles A1 is a light tank, it's only 5 meters long, including the rear support, but the enemy's trenches are about 2 meters wide, so we must determine the direction of the enemy's trenches, otherwise, let alone fighting, just moving through that terrain will be extremely dangerous for the tanks. There's no need for the enemy to destroy them." Charles understood Colonel Estini's meaning. The Charles A1 had to cross the trenches precisely at a 90-degree angle to their direction. Even a slight deviation could cause the tank to fall into the trench and become immobile, resulting in the crew being either killed or seriously injured. Note, Renault tanks are 1.75 meters wide, making them easy targets for 2-meter-wide trenches. This might seem easy during the day, but avoiding it in the dead of night is an impossible task, especially since the trenches aren't straight, they're irregularly zigzagged, and there are numerous communication trenches. "We can circumvent this with infantry coordination," Charles replied. "No, General," Estini shook his head, "tank crews can't hear infantry shouts from inside the roaring engines. I didn't say coordination by shouts." Charles interrupted Estini, "We can use Molotov cocktails." "Molotov cocktails?" Estini was taken aback. "What are Molotov cocktails?" Chapter 424 Only One Day. Although the Molotov cocktail is primitive, merely a throwing bottle, its effectiveness is in no way inferior to other equipment. Its key lies in its simplicity. Other weapons might require consideration of design, gunpowder, and technology, a series of things beyond the reach of ordinary people. A Molotov cocktail is simply a glass bottle, a little gasoline, and a strip of cloth plugging the opening. Charles set up a Molotov cocktail in just a few minutes, lit the cloth, and tossed it a distance. With a crisp snap, flames instantly erupted where it landed. "This is a Molotov cocktail, it will be excellent night fighting equipment." Charles gestured towards the flames. "Infantry can throw it into enemy trenches, and tanks can use it to determine the trench layout." Colonel Estini and Tycoon, standing nearby watching this, were dumbfounded. Such a simple combination could produce an effect similar to, or even better than, a hand grenade, yet only Charles could have conceived of it. After a long while, Tycoon exclaimed, "Just like I said, this is the allure of war. I'm starting to feel sorry for those enemies dying under Molotov cocktails." Tanks rumbled across the flame-filled trenches, still pursuing the fleeing German troops. Only minutes had passed since the previous German trench collapsed, not a second had passed in between. The artillery in the German fortress finally opened fire. They no longer cared about friendly fire, They couldn't just watch their fortress defenses crumble. But then they realized they had missed their only chance to destroy the enemy tanks. 100 meters was too close. The target tank's speed exceeded the maximum angular velocity of the fortress's guns, causing their guns to lag behind by half a beat. The result of firing so carelessly was not only missing the target, but the muzzle flash also attracted a barrage of enemy artillery fire. Although the fortress didn't need to worry about the French 75mm guns, the flashes and smoke from the shells immediately obscured the already meager visibility, leaving them helpless inside. Rolf had given up command. He realized the fall of Antwerp was inevitable, and the German defenses were utterly vulnerable to Charles' forces. Ironically, not long ago he and General Marcus had thought they could thwart Charles' plans and halt his advance. Now it seemed like a pipe dream. Desperate, Rolf abandoned his escape attempt. He turned and silently watched the tanks rumbling towards him, unmoved by the anxious shouts of his guards. The tanks drew closer and closer. The battle ended after a little over an hour. The tanks, traveling at almost 6 kilometers per hour, rammed through 2 layers of defenses in a single attack, reaching the heart of Antwerp. Now came the most troublesome part. Large numbers of German troops retreated into the city, attempting to organize a defense using the city's buildings. The German army had reinforcements, and their forces were likely numerous and increasing. Combined with the German troops fleeing from the front lines, they would work with the remnants of the besieged forces in Antwerp to launch a pincer attack on Charles's army. However, the German army, lacking unified command, ultimately proved ineffective. Just as Charles was struggling to figure out how to completely recapture Antwerp and organize a defense before German reinforcements arrived, the Germans sent representatives to surrender to the French. Thus, the Battle of Antwerp ended in cheers. Charles not only recaptured this formidable national fortress, but also took possession of almost all of its facilities, including fortresses, emplacements, defensive lines, and 23 105mm howitzers. The next morning, the first thing Parisians did after waking up was to discuss with their families at the dinner table where Charles's troops had advanced. They believed that victory was a foregone conclusion. Charles would never be defeated. The key question was how long it would take Charles to achieve this victory. Some guessed half a month, some a month, and others thought it might take half a year. After all, it's one country, they said. The Allied powers have sent hundreds of thousands of troops and a powerful fleet, yet they haven't made an inch in the Dardanelles. Charles, on the other hand, only has a tank brigade and an infantry regiment, and they're dealing with the Germans. Soon, this view gradually became the consensus. People believe that Charles's offensive should be viewed rationally, and that Charles shouldn't be mythologized, thinking he could achieve victory in just a month or even half a month. This will be a protracted battle, and undoubtedly many soldiers will sacrifice themselves, but in any case, we are advancing now, which is much better than the previous stalemate. It is Charles who has changed this stalemate. We cannot ask too much of him. Joka and Camille didn't sleep all night. When Camille got up to make breakfast, her eyes were sore and red. She had tossed and turned all night, sighing countless times. The newly bought radio kept making static at the foot of her bed, and she would get up every now and then to fidget with it, afraid of missing any information. Joka, sitting at the table, couldn't help but advise, "This is only the first day. We can't go on like this." "I know," Camille replied expressionlessly, "but I can't control myself." Joka regretted buying the radio. His intention was to reassure Camille. "They say this war might last a long time." Camille brought Joka bread but forgot the milk and fruit. Joka hummed in agreement. "You know, Charles doesn't have many troops, but his enemy is very powerful." Joka stopped abruptly, noticing the worry in Camille's eyes. "They should let Charles command more troops," Camille complained. Joka was quite surprised by this. Camille had never mentioned this before. "I figured something out," Camille said weakly, sitting opposite Joka. "Only by ending this war as soon as possible can Charles be safe, don't you think?" Joka nodded in agreement. During wartime, no country would willingly let go of a talent like Charles. Trying to remain uninvolved was merely an unrealistic fantasy. As they ate their bread, deep in thought, a cheer suddenly rang out from outside. "Charles has won. He has achieved a decisive victory." Camille and Joka looked up sharply, exchanged a glance, and simultaneously dropped their bread, opening the door. "Noemi, is it true?" "Charles won. Who told you that?" Noemi shouted back, his voice filled with excitement. "It's true, Mr. Joka. It's news from the army. It happened an hour ago." Charles captured Antwerp and surrounded over 200,000 German troops in just one day. He's incredible. Chapter 425. France was in a frenzy over Charles's brilliant victory. People took to the streets to celebrate, and bars, clubs, and restaurants were packed with people, yet more continued to gather, even if they hadn't ordered anything and were just standing at the door. Everyone was talking about this exciting and unbelievable day. This is the best national day ever. Charles ended the battle before the day even ended. Unbelievable. Everyone, including military experts, thought this battle would last at least 6 months, but Charles only took 1 day. 1 day, I wasn't even mentally prepared, and it was already over. We thought that a victory that would take half a month or a month was deifying Charles, but it turns out that Charles is far more miraculous than we imagined. It wasn't just France that was going crazy. The world was stunned by Charles's seemingly divine stroke of genius. At that time, Italian Chief of the General Staff Cardone was commanding operations on the front lines. A few days earlier, he had ordered the Italian Second and Third Armies, 19 divisions, nearly 200,000 men, to attack the Austrian positions on the east bank of the Isonzo River in 3 columns, while the Italian Navy blockaded sea traffic to Trieste. Cadona's idea was that as long as the bombardment and offensive continued, the enemy would soon collapse due to logistical constraints. However, he hadn't anticipated that his own logistics were equally problematic. Although Italy's supply lines weren't blocked, the logistical supplies required for sustained bombardment and offensive were dozens of times greater than those of the enemy. In just a few days, a month's worth of artillery shells were exhausted, and over 20,000 casualties had been suffered without any progress. Note, the first battle of the Isonzo lasted only 14 days, ending abruptly due to ammunition shortages. The Italian commanders hadn't even properly calculated basic ammunition plans. Just as Cadorna sat at his desk, agonizing over the map, a staff officer rushed to him with a telegram, excitedly reporting, "General, Charles has liberated Brussels, the Belgian capital, and he has also captured Antwerp, a Belgian fortress. This completes the encirclement of over 200,000 German troops." The others in the command post heard this, turning to look at him in astonishment, then erupting in cheers as if they had won the battle. Logically, Cadorna should have felt ashamed at this moment. Charles, with a smaller force, surrounded over 200,000 enemies in just 1 day, while Cadorna, with a superior force of over 200,000, attacked a smaller enemy and suffered a humiliating defeat, even finding himself in dire straits, all within a few days. But Cadorna didn't feel this way, nor did his jubilant staff around him. Italians are naturally optimistic. They rarely consider factors that are detrimental to them or cause them to lose face. "Excellent," Cadorna nodded with a smile, saying smugly, "This proves our decision to join the Allied powers was correct." With Charles here, victory is only a matter of time, the command headquarters unanimously agreed. "General," a calm staff officer reminded him amidst his self-deception, "but the problem remains." "What should we do now?" Cadorna replied easily, "Don't worry, Ricardo. The worst-case scenario is that we don't advance an inch, but as long as France wins, we win. So, what do we have to worry about, at that moment?" Cadorna didn't realize that the worst-case scenario was far more than not advancing an inch. In London, England, the First Lord of the Admiralty sat by the window of his villa, gazing forlornly at the ships coming and going on the Thames. He had recently resigned as First Lord of the Admiralty, withdrawing from the core of power in disappointment, only symbolically serving as a member of the Dardanelles Commission. This was because the battle in the Dardanelles was going poorly. In fact, it wasn't just poorly, but terrible. Reports from the front lines were, the air was filled with a stench of corpses, water supplies were insufficient to quench thirst, the Gallipoli sun was scorching, and there was almost no shade. Giant flies were everywhere. Opening a can of food would immediately result in an attack by them. Most devastatingly, a plague was spreading on the front lines, and soldiers were dying in droves, not from fighting, but from disease. Ultimately, the First Lord of the Navy, who had been most enthusiastic in promoting the campaign and made the guarantees, became the target of widespread criticism. Under pressure from all sides, the First Lord of the Navy was forced to resign. Just as the First Lord of the Navy was staring blankly out the window with a bitter expression, the butler knocked and brought in a telegram. "Sir, General Winter is calling. He says that Charles achieved a decisive victory last night." The First Lord of the Navy was stunned. He thought he had misheard. "I remember Charles only launched the attack yesterday morning." The butler was at a loss. He hesitantly handed the telegram to the First Lord of the Navy. "Should I confirm this?" Of course. The First Lord of the Navy took the telegram and glanced at it. As the butler left, he couldn't help but laugh out loud. How could that be? Victory in just one day? The soldiers hadn't even warmed their rifles yet. Was it April Fool's Day? Or was General Winter using this method to mock him? However, the butler soon returned to the Prime Minister of the Navy. "It's confirmed, sir. Charles has advanced over 100 kilometers in a single day, and his army has surrounded over 200,000 German troops." The Prime Minister of the Navy was utterly shocked. Over 100 kilometers in a day? Surrounded over 200,000 German troops? This was actually true? My God, he had achieved something unprecedented. It's no exaggeration to say he made history. How did he do it? The Prime Minister of the Navy felt a pang of envy for this genius young man, a true military strategist. Then, the Prime Minister of the Navy thought of the mess in the Dardanelles. If anyone could save this battle, it would be Charles. The Prime Minister of the Navy wasn't concerned with the lives of the soldiers on the front lines, but with his political career, and his promise that if the Dardanelles campaign fails, "I will go to the battlefield as a soldier with a rifle." After a moment's hesitation, he rushed to the telegraph room and sent a telegram to General Winter. "Ask Charles if he is willing to return to the Dardanelles to command a battle." This was utterly shameless. When the Dardanelles Strait was initially in turmoil, Charles's arrival improved the situation, and many believed victory was imminent. However, the Prime Minister tricked Charles into leaving, spreading rumors that the Germans know Charles is on the battlefield and will kill him at all costs. Now, with the Dardanelles Strait once again in turmoil, he is again proposing Charles's return to save the Prime Minister's political future. But the word shameless seems to be entirely outside the Prime Minister's vocabulary. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.